Thanks, Jesse. Yeah, I'm Tim, this is Kim. We don't know what we're doing, really. So we've made some slides, and we think that they've got some interesting content, but we haven't, we don't know who's going to present which ones, or we haven't got any we haven't done any rehearsals, which means it might be a bit bumbly and a bit unprofessional, but I think the content's good, and it's a tutorial, so if we do get bumbly and unprofessional, and you don't understand what we're saying, then put your hands up and ask. So we should be taking questions all the time. Can I just get a quick heads up? How many people are mathmos and how many people are... So how many people are mathmos? Put your hands up if you're a mathmo. Put your hand up if your principal specialism is not neuroscience but mathematics. And now put your hand up if you're a neuroscientist. Okay, fine. Okay, so we'll go slow through the computational bits. Right. Hi, Ian and Elliot. These guys don't need it. Okay. All right, okay. Right, we're ready. So we're going to talk about state spaces, basically, which is how you represent the things in your world and how they relate to each other. But we're just going to start. I might just move this up, swap these around. So I'm just going to start by trying to explain why it's important in a sort of broader context. I'm going to start with the fight for the soul of psychology, which happened sometime in the 1940s and 50s. Or actually, it started earlier with people like Pavlov and Thorndike. And so Thorndike is famous for saying, if I do something and I get something good, then I'll do it again. Which seems now to be an easy way to become famous, really. But that's what he's famous for. So he's famous for saying that rewards make you repeat actions that caused those rewards, and shortly after, and sometime after that, Skinner thought that this type of mechanism could explain all of cognition. And so Skinner thought that by chaining together enough actions and rewards, you could get really complicated behaviors that start looking like intelligence. And he was famous for this kind of very aggressive statement of the kind that people from America often make. So he said the real problem is not whether machines can think, but whether men do. Give me a child and I'll shape him into anything. Apparently, you can't shape women into anything, only men. But at roughly the same time, Skinner was talking about the fact that rewards could shape you into anything. There were another set of people who thought that was not true. So Tolman and his chums were interested in this idea of a cognitive map. And so he says something like this. We assert that... I need a microscope to see it on here. We assert that the central office itself is far more like a map control room than it is like an old-fashioned telephone exchange. So he is saying, look, the rat or the animal or the human isn't just doing something because it's valuable. He's doing something because he can imagine what's going to happen around the corner. He's got a model of the world in his head. And so that's a much more respectful version of what a human is than just somebody that's repeating good things. And then, and this became a real fight, and the behaviorists won for a while, and the sort of Gestalt people won for a while. But it's also worth noticing this very clever guy, Harry Harlow, who realized the truth, which is that both things are true. And so he says something like this: I wish this was bigger on here. when an animal learns a new kind of problem, he solves it according to a behaviorist learning theory by slow, painful plodding and trial and error. However, if he has experience with this type of problem before, then he can start building models of that type of problem and solve that problem really quickly. And so he would demonstrate this with monkeys, where he would give them problems that were really easy problems, but it would take them a long time to start with to solve them. But as they had more and more types of problem like that, they'd be able to just solve them in one trial. And so this is like learning to become, to build models or to understand the relationships between things. And so somehow we haven't made much conceptual progress since then, I think, since 1950 or something. But we've been sort of filling in details. And what we're going to try and do today is fill in mathematical details. And so, this thing's one side. Oh, you weren't saying that. Sorry. Yeah. Yeah, so they got really fast at doing it. Sorry, that thing's one slide ahead of where I am. All right. I told you it wouldn't be professional. So we're going to try and fill in some mathsy details. And so we're going to argue that we can write down the maths of reinforcement learning for Thorndike quite well now. And for Skinner, we can write down some really good maths for learning in large state spaces where the rewards are not immediately contingent on the actions, but might be contingent on various things that change because of the actions or those kinds of things. And then for Tolman, we've got good at we've started to understand mathematically how you might represent the relationships between things in the brain, and we now have some maths for that, and we call that representing state spaces. And then I think somehow what Harlow was saying was it's really important that you make really good representations of the world, and if you do, then learning is really easy. And then so Kim's going to talk a lot about how do you make a good representation of the world. And then we've got a few other things that we... sorry. Thorndike's got some glasses. I forgot about that joke. Right, it wasn't very good. So, and then there's a couple of other things that we think that we can do that they hadn't thought of. Which Kim and I are going to talk about, which are... I'm actually just going to stop. Kim, can we just change this so I can see what's on the slide right now? Here?
Oh, right. Yeah, it's in presenter mode.
Yeah.
That's why it's so small.
It's really small and it's saying the wrong thing. It's really confusing to me.
I think if we just mirror instead, it should be really easy. Yeah, it's not like we even have any notes.
Yeah.
Whoa, hello. Cool.
Now I can see the same as you, and I'm not going to be as confused. Okay. So there's a couple of other things. So we think we've got some maths sorted now for making state spaces for good for things that not just learning. So like planning or separating, like classifying things, those kinds of things. And then finally, there's some ideas that we have that we can make state spaces compositional. So you can learn something over here and something else over there and put them together and start understanding how these things can configure with one another. And that's basically going to be the that's how the day is going to go. We're going to take you through these different types of these different parts of the argument slowly, one by one. Okay. But we're going to start with a bit of reinforcement learning, which is Skinner and which is the Thorndike and Skinner part of the world. But it's also going to allow us the chance to introduce what we mean by a state space. So here's a reinforcement learning problem that many of you will see in the future. No, that's not what I was expecting. That's not the slide that I was expecting. Yeah, maybe we'll go back to that in a bit. So what reinforcement learning does is it's a way of doing what Skinner was saying. So what you want to do, the definition of the problem, is you just want to get as many rewards as you can in the long term, and you have the job of discovering what to do without any instructions or without any understanding of the world, and and so therefore you're able to. So what you want to do is say, okay, here I can see what I can see around me, and I've got some actions. Which action should I take if, in the long term, I want to get some reward? And the reinforcement learning problem solves that problem for us. And so it can be applied in many different domains, to rodents running around mazes, or to people playing chess, for example. And I'm hopefully going to give an example. This is. I don't know which slides are coming next. Yeah. Do you want to do this section? I feel like this is going to be a problem for.
Yeah, this was a bold move on my part, so let's see how I do with this section. So basically, the point we wanted to make here is what the reinforcement learning problem is. That you want to set it up as maximizing reward, and that this is a little bit different than other types of learning where either somebody tells you the right answer, which is supervised learning, or you're trying to do some sort of more unsupervised task, like pull out patterns from the data you've seen. This jumble of seemingly unrelated pictures is my attempt to capture what's nice about the RL framework, which is that it's quite general. You can apply it to lots of different types of problems. You can think about chess as a problem where you're trying to maximize the reward of winning a game. You can think about cooking as a problem where you want to maximize the probability of a delicious meal, maybe in as short preparation time as possible. And you can think of maze navigation, a more kind of concrete problem, as thinking about how to find as many delicious bits of cereal in your house as possible. Hopefully that's not actually how you start your mornings, but who knows. So this is a very general framework, and then there's the question of how we actually formalize it, how we break this into concrete parts. And Markov decision processes are a really popular formalism for doing that. And what a Markov decision process consists of is that you have an agent in some environment. The environment contains a bunch of states that the animal can occupy, sort of like an abstract notion of location. It has actions that permit it to move through this environment and transition between states. And it has an environment that contains transition structure and reward information. So when the animal takes actions, it'll move, or the agent or human takes actions, it'll move through this environment according to some probability distribution, which is how we define the environment. So this is sort of what this loop looks like. Agent takes actions, environment says what happens, agent sees what happens, and uses this to change how it's making actions. In the RL case, it's changing its actions so that it tries to get more reward. So we have a cute little example of what an MDP is, and maybe kind of something about RL. It is taken from slides by Jakob and Tim's lab, and he took them from some guy, Andrew Moore, who has them on the internet. So basically, this is supposed to characterize as cartoonishly as possible the life of a PI. So PI starts out poor and unknown. Not that many papers, not that many grants. PI now has the choice of whether they want to write some papers or write some grants. If they apply for a grant, they're not going to get it. They're unknown. So they're just going to transition back to being poor and unknown. If they write a paper, there's a half chance that it won't work out and they'll just stay poor and unknown. But maybe they'll transition to being poor and famous. So that would be pretty fun. Once you're poor and famous, you have this choice again. At this point, maybe you can apply for a grant. Maybe you'll get it this time, and then you can be rich and famous. Or maybe you'll write another paper and just stay poor and famous. Once you're rich and famous, you can apply for grants. Maybe you'll get them, maybe you won't, because of the opportunity cost. If you don't get it, you'll go to being rich and unknown, still not so bad. Or you can write a paper, lose out on a new source of money, go back to being poor and famous, but you still have the chance of applying for a grant again and being rich and famous. There's a nice little loop there. And then once you're rich and unknown, you have a similar set of options with a transition structure available to them. So even in this task, which has 4 states and 2 actions, it's really quite complicated. I think one thing that's very nice about this example is the difficulty of planning in this simple task is maybe fairly intuitive to people because this is a very difficult strategic decision and you get feedback on a very long time scale. To illustrate the parts of the MDP, just to be clear, all of these blue things are states, all of these black things are actions, and all of these transitions and reward structure are the environment. And kind of an interesting point here, one thing I noticed about this MDP is that the reward comes, these little green squares, comes from being rich and from getting grants. The money is equal to the reward. And that's kind of, I think that kind of makes some sense because that's like often how we set up psychology or neuroscience experiments with humans is you just give them actual money and that's the reward that's used. But in the case of a PI life, being famous might not actually be more or less rewarding than being rich. Like you might think of grants as a means to do your research, or you might think of your research as a means to get grants. And the fact that reward is set by the environment rather than set by the actual agent is an interesting property of MDPs, and is actually something people like argue about a lot. Is how should we account for the fact that like reward is really very subjective and not just an external factor? Cool. Even in this MDP that you have full knowledge of, planning can be difficult, but it might be even harder if you're trying to learn about this environment from trial and error. So if nobody told you how being a PI worked or being a researcher worked, and you didn't have any inside knowledge about maybe when you should have grants or write papers or how you should be prioritizing, you would have to just learn it by trial and error. So in this case, you have a decision about when you should exploit options you know to be good, or when you should explore and try out things that you don't know so well how they'll turn out. And there's a couple strategies for doing this. Generally, exploration in RL, especially in these simpler frameworks, just means like randomly picking. So instead of like a methodic search, it's just you randomly pick from the available options. This has a lot of nice properties, but some inefficiencies too. Some of the methods for doing it are epsilon greedy. In that case, you just, every once in a while, you just randomly pick an action. No matter how long you've been in the task, you're still randomly picking actions every 1 over epsilon steps, or on average. With softmax, it's a bit more sophisticated theoretically. In that case, you're choosing proportional to this softmax function over value. That means that a more valuable option is more likely to get picked, but you give a bit of a boost to less valuable options to keep a bit of randomness. If you're familiar with maximum entropy methods, it has its root there. Then there's also this, like, it's kind of considered a hack, but it's like a philosophically interesting hack, which is optimistic initialization. And in this case, you set all of your initial estimates to be unrealistically high. And that means as soon as you explore an option, your value of it is going to go down because there's just no way it could be as high as you set your expectations, which means that the things that will have the highest value in your estimation will be things you haven't looked at yet. Just because, and that's kind of, I don't know, I think that's kind of cute because we think of children as very like optimistic and exploratory. But it's considered a bit of a hack because, like, how do you really know where to set your expectations in the first place? I don't know. All right. That was some of the early bits of RL. Now we're going to transition into learning these rewards in complex state spaces and what these state spaces look like. We'll get a bit about what state really means. Before I think like the arc we want to set up right now is that eventually we're going to tell you a lot of things about states and how you infer what a state should be and how you represent it in a way that supports efficient planning. But we need to tell you some more things about learning and planning before we do that. So if there's some uncertainty, it might get resolved later. So first, a really important dichotomy in RL is this idea of model-based versus model-free. This is about how you're using an internal model of the outcomes of your actions to inform behavior. This is what model-based is about, or not using such a model, which is more model-free. Oh no, these are going in the wrong order. Okay, so let's say you get to a traffic light. You have a decision about your brain makes a decision about what process it could use to solve this problem. One idea would be to use your knowledge of how actions affect outcomes and reason through the process of what will happen if you do or do not stop at this traffic light. Another thing would be to do something more model-free, where you see a stimulus and it has a conditioned response associated with it. So for a traffic light, you could think to yourself, okay, if I press the pedal, the car will slow down, I won't coast into this intersection and get hit by an oncoming car or get a ticket or some negative outcome. You might think about the other one, like, what if I don't press the pedal? I'll just go for it. It's 2 in the morning, no one's out here anyway. Not that that's how I drive, and don't tell my mom. And then the other option is just red light, I'm gonna press the pedal. I don't think it through, I'm not dedicating that many cognitive resources to it. I know what a red light means, and that just goes right to my foot. If we think about this in the, If we think about this in the MDP we had originally, then you can, once you know your model of this environment, then you can think to yourself, if I publish a paper, then this is how it's going to go. There's these risks associated with it. I can go through all the possible outcomes. Or you might just have a habit of like, you know what, I'm just like gonna compulsively write papers and like just hope that works out for me. Or whenever you're poor, you apply for grants, and whenever you're rich, you write papers. Or you might have some more automatic method for doing this, or you might learn from trial and error more automatically what you should be doing in each of these states. And that would be a more model-free approach. So to go through a little bit more formally, model-free learning. So one of the things that you need to do in order to do model-free learning is to know how valuable each state is. So you want to know what is the expected future reward that I can get from each of these states, and that'll help you in your problem of reasoning about which actions to take next. You just pick the one that gives you the most value. So we're going to formally define value as the discounted sum of all future reward. So this term here is a discount factor, and it means that you're going to care more about rewards that happen really soon than rewards that happen very far away in the future. This is partly a hack, because if you don't have anything like this, it might diverge to infinity unless you know when you're going to die. But if you, sorry, that's a dark joke, but no one laughed. But it also has this like psychological interpretation, which is people really do care more about things that happen sooner. And a good interpretation from machine learning, if you don't care about things that happen sooner, it's hard to get off the ground with learning because you're reasoning about this very distant future that you don't really have enough information to predict yet. And R is going to be the reward that you get at each point in time. You can learn value online through trial and error using temporal differences method. So basically, at each point in time, you're going to have a new estimate of the value for your current state. So you're going to take your old estimate, and you're going to add a prediction error to it that's scaled by some learning rate. And what the reward prediction error is this. It's going to be the actual observed value that you saw. You saw some amount reward, and then you got to a state that you have some estimate of how valuable it is. And you're going to subtract what you previously thought value was. This is basically how much better did things turn out than I thought they were going to. You increment your value accordingly, and then eventually you can learn a nice value function for all of the states. This can be kind of a slow, gradual process, but you eventually learn value of all states. Since you're learning from prediction errors, it might take a while for information to make it through your environment. If we just take this linear state space right here, we're going to ask what's the value of this first state. On trial 1, we don't know, but we do know that there's reward at the end of the maze because we saw that. Trial 2, we learn, hey, I got some reward or I reached a more valuable state than I thought I was going to when I moved from the second to last state to the last rewarding state. So I'm going to update the value of that. As I keep following this process, the reward information makes it further and further back. And eventually, I know that all of these states are really valuable because no matter what happens, I'm getting to the reward at some point.
So I'm just going to interrupt.
Yeah, please.
So Kim's done that brilliantly, but she's gone very fast. And so at this point here, it's just worth getting a feel for what's happening here. These guys, so this agent who's just learning the value of a really simple state space didn't need to know anything about which states led to which other states. It never needed to know that. All he had to know is when I think the value currently is 4, and I'm moving, and suddenly the value's a bit more than 4, and he has to make that it's like iterating. He has to make that function smooth. If there are any big jumps in that function here, any big jumps in that function, like at the start, then model-free learning is going to smooth out those jumps, and it's going to spread the value back along the policy, along the actions that you took. Slowly. But you can see that it happens over many, many, many trials, because if you were a clever person, you would know immediately, looking at that the first state was rewarding, right? Because once you've chosen the first state, the definite endpoint is that reward, right? So you can just look at that thing and say the first state's rewarding. That's what model-based learning would do. Model-free learning will not do that. It will just slowly move the reward back through the states because it never knows those arrows. It never knows where the transitions are. So model-free learning doesn't know the transitions, but it does still need to know the states. And as you'll see later, if we'd chosen a more intelligent state space, even model-free learning could do really well. And that's the kind of thing Harlow was saying. Right, come back. Sorry? No, why don't you carry on and I'll just be here at campus. We'll get to
Perfect.
Yeah, I'll send it over. I don't mind.
No, this is good. Yeah, we weren't kidding about winging it with the switches. So this brings us to an important neuroscience finding, which probably a lot of people have heard of, which is the reward prediction error hypothesis of dopamine. So this was a really big paper that came out a while ago in 1997. And what they hypothesized and showed some really good evidence for was this idea that phasic dopamine encodes a reward prediction error that could drive value learning. So remember, we had this reward prediction error, and that's what we're using to update our expectations of how valuable things are. Basically, this is what dopamine is encoding. And so in order to, some of the data that they showed illustrating this is that if the animal experiences a reward, then you get a bunch of firing after that happens. After you've conditioned an animal so that some conditioned stimulus predicts the reward, then you end up getting firing right after the conditioned stimulus appears, but no firing once the actual reward appears. The idea is that the reward has been fully predicted by the conditioned stimulus. There's no surprises left for dopamine to encode. However, if the conditioned stimulus happens, you get this firing again, and no reward occurs, you see a bunch of quiet dopamine neurons being like, where did my reward go? This is a lot worse than I was expecting. So this tells you something about how value could be learned by the brain, how expectations should be acquired. There's still the question of how you use this in order to select actions, in order to change what your actual behavior in the world. So one idea is that you have an actor-critic system, in which you have a critic who's trying to learn how valuable actions are, learn a value function, and a policy that's taking actions and trying to figure out what to do with them. So this illustration I found on the internet, for some reason I thought it was really funny because it's just so simple. You have an actor who's playing this video game and is rotating a piece in this, I think it's Tetris, and then his friend is just like really bad action. The critic thought it was going to go well, but it actually went really poorly, and it is informing his friend in a very blunt way how it went. You can see in this diagram that the TD error is going to both value function and policy. The critic uses the prediction error in order to update its value function, and the actor uses this prediction error in order to update its policy. In this case, we have a really similar update rule, but we have a different learning rate, maybe. I'm sorry.
If you told me what a policy is yet.
I haven't. Okay, so that's a really good point. So a policy is a distribution over actions. The way that the agent interacts with the world is it takes actions, and these cause it to transition through the environment. The thing that the agent is doing is trying to pick which actions it should take, and this is formalized as a policy. It's basically a distribution over actions that the agent will refine. Hopefully it will skew this distribution so that actions that lead to better outcomes are more probable.
That's conditional on state.
Sorry, what's that?
The distribution is conditional on state.
So when
Yes.
Kim is obviously right, but because she works in DeepMind, she talks about distributions over. So when you're in a state, there might be 2 or 3 or 7 actions available to you. So right now, the actions available to me are carry on speaking with stupid open legs or close my legs like this. The policy just tells you what is the probability that I'll make each action in that state. That's all it is. And until very recently, like this really blew my mind when I learned this a long time ago. Until very recently, people just used to keep tables. Here are my states. What's the probability that I'll move in this action? I used to think, oh, this is really baffling, really confusing. But then it's not. Literally all you have, until recently when they built neural networks, but now, literally all you do is you keep a table of all your states, and you just change the number in that table. You could do it in Excel, and then you keep and then at each state you have a certain number of actions, and you just say, what's the probability that I should make action 1, 0.4? What's the probability that I should make action 2, 0.3 or something, etc., etc. And so it's really simple. These algorithms are really simple. They're just changing numbers in tables, and you end up choosing and you end up changing those numbers, those 0.4 and 0.3, the probability I take any one action. You change them by learning, and you learn to make those numbers the ones that get you the most reward. That's all we're doing here. Sorry.
No, thank you. And also thank you for the first, I was going to say thanks for the first audience question, and thank you for the second audience question.
So is this written on the slide, the critic should say really bad outcome, right? Rather than, because the critic is updating the state value, not the action value.
Yeah, that's a really excellent point. So this is actually, the critic is making an assumption that the critic shouldn't be allowed to make. A critic should just be saying, that went very poorly. It shouldn't be quite so judgy about it. It can't say really bad action, because maybe that action usually goes really well. It should just be saying something about how the outcome went. Is that your question?
Right.
Or comment?
Also, does this always assume that the transition structure is known, or it doesn't need transition, doesn't need the knowledge of the transition structure, and that's the nice thing about it? I don't know.
So in all model-free learning, the agent does not know the transition structure, right? It just sees the next thing. Obviously, the world knows the transition structure. The environment knows the transition structure, and the agent will just experience one thing at a time, and all it's trying to do is learn values of actions. If I see this thing again, I should turn right. That's why, for example, in deep Q learning, when they learn those Atari games, they could literally present each frame at a time, because all it's learning is, when I see that frame, what's the value of going left, and what's the value of pressing the joystick button. So it's learning what's the value of doing each thing in each state, and it doesn't know anything about how the states transition. The world, it experiences that through the world, but it doesn't store any of that information. That's what makes it model-free learning. So that's really somehow the difference between what Skinner thought and what Tolman thought, right? Tolman thought that you were building a model of the world. I knew what was going to happen next. Skinner never thought that people knew what was going to happen next. They just thought, I can train somebody such that in a situation like this, if I'm in a situation like this again, I'll always do that. That's what Skinner thought. It's all reflex, right?
So this is sort of retrospectively looking at the current state and the previous state and comparing the expected value.
All you know is what your expected value was and what your outcome is. That's all you know in model-free learning. And this, I might just, I'll take another question, then I might just wing for 5 minutes
Sure.
on policy.
I might sit down.
Yeah. Do you have a question?
Yeah. Can you say something general about the transition between the value, that is the output from the critic, to the policy, that is the output of it? Something general.
So I think I was about to wing on that point too. So you don't need to learn policies by actor-critic, and it happens to be a convenient way of doing it, and I think Kim's put it up there because it's similar to a lot of things that happen at DeepMind at the moment. But actually, of course, you can do loads of, you don't even need to have prediction errors. You could just put, make this thing, make the probability of going left bigger if you got a reward and smaller if you didn't get a reward. You don't need to bother with a critic. So really, that's the simplest model-free learning algorithm that you could have, right? A really simple model-free learning algorithm. If I went left and got a reward, increase that thing a little bit. Forget about what I was expecting. That'll actually work. That works. Takes a very long time to learn that way. It turns out that you can do better if you can do better in situations where, if you aren't expecting to get a outcome, then you, if you're not expecting to get an outcome, then you don't make the. So if you fail to get an outcome that you weren't expecting to get, then you don't go and downweight your action probability. But if you fail to get an outcome that you do expect to get, then you do. And if you want to to do that kind of algorithm, then you need to know what you're expecting from each action. And if you want, if you want to know what you're expecting to get from each action, then you need a sort of actor-critic style thing. Otherwise, you can just do like a policy gradient style thing. It's called, where you just try and learn the policy directly, and there's plenty of algorithms that will do that. There's plenty of algorithms that will learn a perfectly good policy and never know what the value is. And there's plenty of algorithms that will learn a perfectly good value, like temporal difference learning, and never know what the policy was, right? Because they'll just you can just they'll just experience the states moving from one to the other. They'll never know that what actions are happening, and but they'll learn a perfectly good policy. And there are people that think that there are parts of your brain that do that. They just learn the value of states, and then it turns out that the most effective thing you can do is if those two things talk to each other. Right? And so if those two things talk to each other, the person that's learning the policy should know how much value, how much reward to expect. Then he can do a better job of learning the policy. And that's what an actor-critic does. Yep, that was my winging few minutes.
Thanks. Cool. Any more questions on actor-critic? This is a really nice place to stop. Yes, please.
I'm trying to understand what exactly the critic buys you
Yeah.
over, for instance, having a system where you're learning values of state action pairs. Is it simply the situations where you just get the reward too infrequently, and so this thing helps bridge it to some extent?
Yeah, I think, so one thing it gets you is that you can, there's a couple things. I think one thing it gets you is that you can separately parameterize how you're updating your policy and how you're updating your value. You're learning from the prediction error in the same, you're learning from the same prediction error, and you could imagine just using like the value function you've learned and softmax to generate actions. But yeah, did you want to add something else? You seem excited.
Difference. So there are these Q learning, there are these SASA and Q learning style things which learn, which instead of learning a state and an action separately, they learn a state action pair. When I'm in here, do that, and the answer. So, and they work very well as well. They and people started off with deep learning with those Q type approaches, but now they don't. Now they use these type approaches, and they do it. I think because of something we're going to talk about later called factorization. If you learn a conjunction, a state action pair, you will experience that state action pair far less often than you will either the state and so you'll get a much better estimate of the value of the state than you will an estimate of the value of the state action pair. And when there's lots of actions, that really matters. You might see, if there's lots of available actions, then you might see a state action 1/20th of the time than you would see a state. And so it turns out you can get a better estimate of the value if you do it this way. But yeah.
So in some sense,
that was the right answer.
this is an inductive bias that state and actions are factorizable in the real world.
So
Most tasks.
So the value of state is factorized from the action. That's the bias that is imposed here. It's not that the value of actions are factorized from the states. That would be a disaster. If I were to choose the action of going to the toilet now, it would be quite embarrassing. Yeah.
Very evocative example. Yeah.
So the advantage of learning the state value is always from the experiences, but don't you still have to experience the conjunction of state and action?
Yeah.
That's what I just said here. So you don't want to make that right action in the wrong state. You definitely have to learn the state action pair for the policy, but you don't for the state.
So it only saves the experience for learning the value of the state.
Yeah, exactly. So if you were doing Q,
Yeah. Do you want to repeat the question too?
So yeah. So I mean, we're into the details of which learning algorithm we're going to get into, and maybe that's fine. Maybe people are interested, but I don't want to get too far into this because this is not really we're not doing an RL session. But the point that's being made is that this has got an S and an A. The policy has got an S and an A, but the V has only got an S. Right? And so I said that was the advantage of that is if you only have an S, then you can experience the state many more times, and so you can get a much better estimate of the value. So that's really good. But the pi, it would be a real disaster for the pi just to have an S or just to have an A. Sorry, because then you would take the same action in every state, which would be a disaster. So the pi has to have both of those two things. The actions have to have both those two things, and you can directly learn the value of both those two things together. The QS, that's called Q learning or Successor learning. You can directly learn that, but if you choose to do so, then you will get you'll lose out the benefit of factorizing the state value. It's not true. The value is just literally the sum of future expected rewards, and so it will be the sum of all the it would be the sum of all the Q values weighted by the policy, weighted by the probability of taking those actions, right? That's what it would be. But here we haven't got any Q values. This isn't a value at all. This pi, right? That isn't a value at all. That's not trying to estimate a value. There's no guarantees that will converge to the future sum of expected rewards. That pi is just a probability of making an action. This value is really a value. It's the expected future sum of of future rewards, right? Yeah. So I mean, we're not really giving an RL session, but anyway.
Yeah. We'll also have like a Q&A thing at the end, so maybe we'll get back to this then. So
and we're also going faster than we thought we were, so we're happy to take questions on RL as well.
Yeah, I mean it does average over. It's given your expected your policy, so it's the expectation given this distribution of actions you'll take.
Of the Qs, but not of the pi's. Yeah.
I saw. Okay, is it quick one? Oh, please, yeah.
We can repeat it, yeah.
Can we pass the extras? Is that not even on? I'll just repeat the comment.
Hello? Okay, so what I wanted to say is if you're in a continuous action space, for example, where you have a continuum of options that you can take, taking actually the max or computing the softmax distribution or the Boltzmann distribution takes a lot of computation as well. So you would have to optimize, and you can't essentially do that computationally efficient. So having this actor, in some sense, gives you a way to learn how to take the action in such a case where it's not computationally feasible. Maybe that's a different perspective as well you could make. Is that? Okay, sorry.
Thanks, yeah, thank you. Cool. Perfect example of a comma. Good job. All right, moving on to model-based now. So that was model-free, and I think one of the key aspects of this that Tim emphasized a few times is that you don't need to know things about transition structure. You watch what happens, you update your behavior accordingly.
But you still need to know the state space, and that's really important. You still need to have a good, half of the next bit of the lecture is about how to make good state space.
Yeah, you don't need to know, you need to know where you are, but you don't need to know where you're going. For model-based learning, you need to have some idea of where you're going. So for model-based learning, in addition to, or instead of learning this value function, you're going to learn a transition model, which is your model of how you transition around the environment. So remember, the thing that the environment specified in our MDP framework is your probability of moving to different states as the result of different actions, how much reward you got when you're there. For model-based learning, the agent builds its own model of what it thinks the environment looks like and uses this to select actions. So in order to actually use this, you have to search your model for the best sequence of actions. This can be really powerful for a lot of reasons. It's a much more sophisticated reasoning process. You have some idea of how things affect each other. If some information changes, you can update that portion of the model and not change everything else. But you need to do this much more computationally intensive process in order to reason.
So we should have put Tom in there, I guess. This is what Tom was arguing the brain is doing, right? Trying to understand what the world looks like.
Yeah, so here's a little example of using model-based reasoning to solve tic-tac-toe. You're playing X. You're in some starting configuration. You need to decide which of these available moves you want to take. You think about taking move 1, and then maybe you think about what O would do as a result, and then you see how often you lose or win as a result from that. You could take any of these other actions, see how they go. You can basically trace out the future because you have a model of how tic-tac-toe works and how things evolve under the game of tic-tac-toe, and you can use this to plan accordingly. So you can, for instance, take an action that only leads to win outcomes for you. That's probably a pretty good way to win at tic-tac-toe. And one of these processes where you're taking your starting state and applying a hypothetical action, seeing how it goes, and then applying more hypothetical actions, this is called a rollout. When we use the phrase rollout, we're talking about these samples from your model that are temporally extended. In the MDP example, you might have slightly more complicated rollouts. Maybe you have one rollout where you move to being poor and famous, and then you transition around based on some sampling from the probability distribution you know about. You could sample a different thing, get very different outcomes. In this task, because there's a lot more stochasticity to it, these rollouts can be a lot loopier and more complicated. So this brings us to another neuroscience point. It was found by Johnson and Reddish, and other people have reported really similar things, that if you look at the hippocampal activity during these things called theta sweeps or theta precession, and we'll get back to defining some of these terms later, but just for now, the idea that's really important is that you see hippocampal activity kind of doing these predictive sweeps. So it seems to have some impression of where the animal is and sweeps forward to consider different options that the animal might take. There's these decision points, and at those decision points, you see these forward sweeps that are indicative of the animal's future behavior. To contrast model-based and model-free, model-based generally involves these computationally expensive rollouts, and that's its major downside, is that action selection with a model is kind of hard, but they offer pretty good flexibility. When one thing changes, you only need to update that thing. If you learn something new about one transition or your reward function changes, you can keep using your model to plan because you don't need to relearn everything from scratch. With model-free learning, your action selection is this very efficient lookup. You just look up in your table, how valuable is this action generally? And if it's pretty valuable, you can take it. But when one thing changes, you need to relearn everything. And that's because you didn't have any explicit model of the structure in your environment. So if you have something that depends on that structure in a completely different way, you have no way of going in and twiddling with the settings. You just only have this outcome measure, and that all needs to be relearned. There's some other downsides. This is sort of the traditional downside to model-based learning, but there's some other downsides too, particularly when you get into more complicated environments. If you have an environment that's really not that well modeled as an MDP, and you're trying to learn some big fancy neural network with a complicated transition function. And what happens is that if your model is pretty wrong, which it's almost certainly going to be at first, you can get these errors that accumulate very quickly in your rollouts. You take one step in your rollout, it has a little bit of error, your next step has a little bit of error, your next step has a little bit of error. Soon you have a lot of error, and if you're trying to plan very far into the future with such a model, this can be really tough. Also to just make the point again, both require states to be inferred and encoded, and the way you encode states can affect the effectiveness of either method.
Maybe just worth, again, giving an example of the simpler error mode. So Kim was saying model-free learning is really bad when you're when something changes in your environment, and so it's just useful. Maybe I don't know if that is sunk in with everybody or what she meant by that, but what she meant was I'm on a road home from work, and and I take the same route all the time, and I know that when I see a particular junction, I need to turn left, right? That's a model-free situation. But if one day there's a sign saying roadworks 20 miles ahead, road closed, then a model-free learner will still turn left, right? Because right then, right now, he's not thinking about the future, he's thinking about right then, right now, this looks like the place I turn left. And so a model-free learner turns left. A model-based learner plans, oh, I'm going to get stuck there. Okay, roll back, where else could I go? That's the difference between a model-based and a model-free learner.
Actually, another example from this, also a driving example, is when I tried to drive in the UK, which was not a huge disaster, mostly, like one flat tire, but like it wasn't a huge disaster, because even though I've spent all of my adult life driving in the US, where you drive on the right side of the road, I could switch because I have this model of how like driving laws work, and I can condition on this, I can switch to driving on the left side of the road. Did I get the sides of the road right? Okay. Well, you know, that's another risk. I think like one of the things that was interesting about this is when I was driving with another person, we were trying to navigate for each other, and some of the words we used didn't quite work so well anymore. And this gets into this idea of state representation. For instance, when I think left, or left lane, I think faster lane. So I'm more likely to drive towards the inside lane of a multi-lane highway. So we started using words like driver side and passenger side, or towards me, or just gesturing wildly, or being like, no, 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 not that one. Because that sort of was a way that we could be more adaptive and have our language actually express the concepts that we'd accidentally over-anchored to to like left and right. Yeah. So model-free and model-based learning in the brain, lots has been done on this distinction. Some of the early work was hypothesizing that prefrontal cortex is doing this more deliberate model-based style reasoning, where you're thinking about where you are, what you can do, reasoning through that in a forward predictive way, whereas striatum is doing something more like caching value. So yes?
Sorry, I studied a question about Tim's example, actually, about this turning left at intersections. So with the model-based learner, I mean, this would be kind of future thinking in a way, like I know that the road will be blocked, like whatever number of states ahead. Sorry. So I had a question.
Do you want to just start the question from scratch? You have to hold it really close to your mouth.
Is it on? Yeah. Okay, so I had a question about Tim's example, actually, about the blocked road. So the model-based learner would kind of think ahead and say, like, the road is blocked, and I should change my action at this state now. But like, that would mean basically changing the transition probability for a state in the future, right? And not experiencing a change in the transition probability, and then updating the representation accordingly, right? So
it's clearly the case that the fact that he can do that means he's got a model. But there's then a whole another set of questions about is that model learned through, so you could then choose to learn that model through experience using TD-like algorithms or whatever, or you could choose to build that model by coming to a lecture and let us try to build that model in your brain. Model-based learning says nothing about how you built that model. There's a whole nother set of questions about how you would go about building that model, an interesting set of questions that I'm particularly interested in.
So this brings us to how we can tell if an animal or human is using model-based or model-free strategies in order to behave. Basically, these are parallel these are both different strategies that you can use in order to behave optimally. So a lot of times they're going to lead to the same answer. If you can basically get pretty good behavior out of both these strategies, so you need to devise something clever in order to get a behavioral signature of when you're using one strategy or another. So this is a famous way to do it. This task is called the two-step task. A lot of people have heard of it. Nathaniel Daw came up with it, but this is my favorite illustration of it. It's the version that was designed for children. And it's got really cool cartoons. It came out of Kate Hartley's lab. Basically, you have this first choice, which is which action you're going to take. Are you going to get in the blue spaceship, or are you going to get in the green spaceship? Blue spaceship takes you to a planet filled with red aliens most of the time. Or maybe they were monsters, red monsters most of the time. And these monsters will give you some amount of treasure. The amount of treasure they gives you changes over time. Every once in a while, blue spaceship takes you to the purple planet with all the purple aliens, and the amount of ore that they give you also is fluctuating over time. You have the reverse probability structure with the green spaceship. So usually green spaceship takes you to the purple planet. Every once in a while, it takes you to the red planet. Ultimately, you want to get as much of this treasure as possible. And in order to tell whether people are using something model-based or model-free, you can look at what happens after they experience an uncommon transition. So if they choose the blue spaceship and go to the purple planet and get a lot of treasure, they might decide, if they're doing something model-free, I should keep picking the blue spaceship. It went really well last time. I'm just going to keep doing that. However, if you're using a model, if you have some idea of the transition structure of this environment, then you say, okay, purple planet went really well, but blue is not actually the most reliable way to get there. I should probably take the green spaceship. So looking at how your behavior changes after these uncommon transitions can tell you whether you're using a model or not, whether you're doing something more model-based that takes into account the transition structure, or if you're doing something that's more model-free and automatic, or averaging over these transitions. So there was some recent work showing that certain aspects of model-based require hippocampus. There is a rat study where Kevin Miller and in Brody Lab came up with this version of the task that they could train rats to do, and found that if you lesion hippocampus, a lot of your model-based planning goes away. Something similar happens if you lesion OFC. You need these areas in order to have the model-based component of their behavior. There's also a study that came out recently showing that hippocampal amnesics were impaired on spatial memory, which makes a lot of sense and was known about hippocampal amnesics, but are also impaired on model-based planning tasks. The model-based component of their two-step behavior went down a lot. So this suggests that hippocampus, which we're going to talk about a lot more later, is involved in some of these processes. So there's a couple ideas for how the brain might be integrating these two systems. You've got maybe two decision-making processes going on in your head. How do you either decide between them or use them to inform each other? One idea, the original idea about this, is you just have two parallel systems, and they both propose actions, and they also propose some uncertainty associated with their actions. So they're saying, what do I think is best, and also how sure am I? And you just pick the one that the system is more sure about. Another idea is this thing called DINA, in which you're using the model-free policy in order to make your decisions, but you use the model to train up this model-free policy. So basically, the information that's in your model gets sent into your model-free or your model-free value function by taking these. They're called Bellman updates, Bellman backups from your model, where you basically roll your model out a couple times, see how it goes, and then store that information in your value function and use that to actually inform your behavior. Another idea is that you're doing this thing called model-based search to depth. It's also called bootstrap tree search sometimes, where you have a model-based system that's planning, but it doesn't want to plan forever. That tree gets really big. So it just plans to some point, and at that point, it uses whatever value function has been stored at that node. So it sort of rolls out, and then it's like, I'm bored, I'm at this state, what is the model-free value that's associated with this state from now on? So in that case, like, model-based is sort of in charge, but like defers to the value function. In DINA, model-free is sort of in charge, but gets informed by the model-based. Did you want to? Okay, cool. This, also alluding to hippocampus, there was this really neat paper that came out recently showing that some of the activity in hippocampus that occurred when the animal was at rest could be understood as providing the optimal updates for a model-free value function that were sampled from a model. There's two terms they identified as contributing to whether or not it's a good idea to play some element of your model. You can imagine sampling lots and lots of sequences from your model. Some of them might not actually be that useful for your current behavior. This first term is called the gain term. I think the font is quite small, but basically what this term means is how much does this update, does this sample from the model, change the policy that I'm considering taking. So for instance, if it's near a rewarded location, that could be sending around a lot of information that's really relevant to changing your value function. This other term are how likely are the affected states to be relevant. So for instance, your model could be really wrong in some part of the environment, but you're not going to go there anyway. Your value function could be really wrong in some part of your environment, but if you're not likely to go there anyway, there's not that much point in updating it. And they used this to explain a lot of different effects that are seen in the hippocampal activity that appear during these sharp wave ripple patterns. Some of them are that the odds of forward replay before a run and reverse replay after a run are well predicted by this model. Once you get information about the reward, then that's likely to affect your gain term. It's likely to be something that really affects your future behavior. You learn something about reward and you want to make sure you know it for next time. Before a run, you have a lot of information about what you're likely to do next. So that one you can use to affect your need term, how likely it is that you're going to need something. Yes, please. Yes. I think is the point you're making is like this is it doesn't tell you necessarily how you're going to know ahead of time if something helped or not. So I think in this work they use this to explain why certain replay events were the useful ones to have, but there's still the question of how do you compute this gain term ahead of time. You don't want to try and just make every possible update and then see which one was best and then actually play that one. That's not really like it's hard to ahead of time know which one is the right term or the right thing to replay in order to maximize your gain. So there's, I think, a lot of future work in terms of just like developing heuristics or some sort of ahead of time knowledge of what's going to be useful for that gain term. Did I get that right? Okay, cool. Should we swap out?
What I think we should do is this. So we're now an hour in, and I've just taken a look, and we are actually about a third of the way into our slides. So unfortunately, it is going to take 3 hours, this ridiculous event.
We have 4.5 though, so that's actually pretty good.
And I'm aware from lecturing in Oxford that people stop concentrating after 40 minutes, which means you've already stopped. And so I wonder if we should break twice, and therefore break now and then break again in another hour's time for sort of 15 minutes each time, because we've got till 5:30. Does that sound sensible? Just so everyone can just like, okay, let's try and do that. And the other thing that I wanted to, is this kind of working? So my description of the event so far is that Kim gives like a beautifully elegant, concise description of everything. And then I sometimes realize that Oxford undergraduates wouldn't understand that. And I sort of stand up and try and give a different explanation. Is that kind of working, or is okay? Okay, fine.
Cool. Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Depending how much you already know, you will either give up trying to understand what's happening in future slides, or you'll be able to follow. So I guess basically I'm saying it is going a bit fast.
Yeah.
Even though like I've had lectures on these multiple times, I'm still struggling to catch up. So I can only imagine if somebody who doesn't have this background. Yeah.
Yeah, I think actually.
Thank you.
Okay, that's fine. I had that impression as well, that some of the slides were going too fast. I actually think that a lot of what we're going to say doesn't depend on the details of the things we were talking about earlier. Really what you need to have got from this session is that however you're going to learn from something, you need a good way of representing those state spaces. The hippocampus is probably involved in representing those state spaces somehow, and Stratham is probably involved in learning it via these cool model-free mechanisms. If you've got that kind of stuff, I think that you'll mostly follow what comes next. There are a few pieces of what comes next, particularly in Kim's later slides, that you shouldn't be worried if you don't understand. But most of what comes, but most of what comes next isn't so mathematical. Yeah. Okay.
I also wanted to, while the microphone is making it to the back of the room, I just wanted to do a quick survey. Who understood 100% of the slides that have been presented in the last section? Cool. Oh my God, wow, so many of you. Okay, who understood, can you raise your hands higher actually so I can just see who you were? Not identify, but just get a percentage. Okay, who understood 0%? Just like that was a waste of an hour. Who got like 50%? 75%?
Yeah.
Okay, so this isn't terrible. Yeah.
Right, we're going to carry. Okay, we're going to take a break now. We've got 2 more sessions like that coming. I've got another.
Yes.
Oh,
Just a logistical question. Are the slides available on the internet somewhere?
Shh. Wait, can people settle down a little bit?
Logistical question. Are the slides available on the internet somewhere?
we can make them available if you want us to. Yeah.
Oh yeah, totally.
Yeah.
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 Yeah, we'll definitely post them online. We'll also like probably add some a couple like references and stuff. Yeah. Just yeah. Okay, so based on a couple during the break questions, I'm going to just represent the last slide that I ended on. I think I could go through that a little bit more gradually. First, I want to clarify what a model-based rollout is, what we mean by that term. It's a little bit colloquial, but what it refers to is one forward look ahead in your model. So, for instance, if I do the following, if I think to myself in my simulated model, I'm going to make this move, and then maybe this is going to happen, and then maybe I'm going to make another move, and then maybe an outcome will happen. That's one rollout. You simulate a trajectory into the future, but you don't actually experience that trajectory. You can think of it as simulated experience. If you have this whole decision tree, to explore that whole decision tree, you would need many rollouts. This whole tree isn't just like one rollout. Also, I want to go through the ideas about integrating model-based and model-free a little bit more slowly. And feel free to just like raise a hand and be like, my intuition is this. Is that right? And I'll say like, yes, probably, because there's a lot of ways to think about this. So the first way, and I think in some sense the simplest way and the first one that we formalized, is this idea that you just have 2 parallel systems for proposing, this is weird, for proposing actions, and they just compete with each other. They're just both going, this isn't working? You're right. I could probably just like shout this into the How's this? Okay, I'll go to this one. I need to pace. All right, so both of these are proposing actions in parallel. They're telling you what they think the value of that action is, and they're telling you how sure they are. So they have some uncertainty measure over their estimation. A downstream system says, I'm going to pick the system that is more sure about its action and go forward with that action accordingly. So basically, there's many ways that you could set up an arbitration system. This one is called uncertainty-based arbitration. You could do something like just say, well, this system said it was going to get $10, and this system only said $1. I'm going to go with a $10 system. And honestly, that's probably how humans make a lot of decisions, but it's really not a very robust way to do arbitration. But then learning a probabilistic model is hard. Anyway, this system is quite a bit different. I think with Dyna, you can think of it as model-free, being in control, but model-based can tell model-free to update its actions. So if we were to just ignore the entire left side of this plot, we would just have model-free learning. You have a model-free agent taking actions, getting experience, and then doing reinforcement learning in order to decide what to do next. But you also have this term on the left, which is trying to learn a model of what's happening. And then, based on that model, it simulates different futures that could happen and uses this to change the value function. So you can think of it as model-free, but you have both actual experience and simulated experience. And this allows you a lot more flexibility. You can take some of the information that's stored in your model and basically put it into the value function. You can say, like, I learned something is different, but my experience so far has been really inconsistent with that. I better just simulate this a whole bunch of times so model-free guy knows about it. This one I think of as more having model-based at the helm, where ideally you would be doing full model-based rollouts until you explored your whole decision tree. So you simulate a future, simulate a future, simulate a future, and then you pick the future that goes the best for you with some high reliability. So that's what's depicted on the left, tree search to the end of your life. Of course, this is hard to actually do. So there's this idea that you can search to a particular point, and at each point, at each point that you search to in your simulated model, you have a model-free system that says, I think that the value from this state onward is going to be roughly this. So you're searching to depth. You're basically searching to some point that is permitted within your computational bandwidth, and then from then on, model-free takes over. Does that make sense? Yes. Yes, pure habit is model free. You can think of this as, I think in both of these cases, you can think of an edge case that's purely model free. One is where you search to depth 0 for the search to depth problem. For Dyna, you could just say, I don't have any model and I'm just doing this direct experience. For a model-based versus model-free competition, you could just imagine lesioning the model-based system. Yeah, I think these don't all have the edge case where you can be purely model-based, but model-free is always at one corner of the spectrum. Yes?
Hi. In the first one, the model-free versus model-based, where is the uncertainty coming from?
Yeah, so this is not something we have discussed at all. And I think basically you need to do something additional to these models to make them give you some estimate of uncertainty. So instead of learning one value estimate where you're just saying, I think my expected value from this point onward is this, you can use something similar in order to get a distribution over value functions. And you can still do it in a model-free way, but instead of just having this one parameter, which is your average expected value, you also have more parameters in your distribution, like maybe mean, or maybe standard deviation, or maybe whatever parameters of whatever distribution you're using. Sorry, that's probably a sentence I should avoid. But you have to add something else additionally. And actually, I think Sam Gershwin's probably talking about this in his tutorial concurrently.
Just a quick follow-up. So is it coming from the world being like volatile itself, or is it like something inherent in the learning system itself? Like, I don't know. Nice.
Yeah, sorry, why don't you take this then?
So model 3 is uncertain when you haven't experienced that state very often, usually, or when it has, when you haven't experienced that state very often, or when you haven't experienced, or when you haven't experienced or when you haven't experienced the things that would lead to reward from that state very often. But the main reason that model 3 is going to be uncertain is because you haven't experienced that state very often. Model-based has to learn a lot more than model 3, right? Because model-based has to learn all the transitions. And there are many more transitions than there are states. Like in a fully connected world, there are n² transitions if there are n² states. And so model-based is going to be, it's much harder to learn a model-based system than it is to learn a model-free system. But similarly, how certain the model-based system is going to depend on how often it's experienced the transitions and how regular they've been each time they've taken that action, right? So like I'm here, I turn left. If I always get to the same place, I only have to experience it a couple of times. But if it can be stochastic, then I have to experience it more times.
So in the two-step decision model that you mentioned, there the model-based would be uncertain, but like with 60% certainty, it knows that the blue spaceship takes you there. And
no.
That's the type of uncertainty, or
No.
that's not? Okay.
So there's two different types of uncertainty that we're worried about, right? So there's uncertainty that is innate to the world, right? There's which is the probability of things happening, right? So a model-based system, that's what they're trying to learn. So a model-based system is trying to learn if I'm at this state, and what's the probability that turning left will get me to that state, right? If there's stochasticity in the world, that might be 0.7, and the best you could ever do is make 0.7, but that's fine. That comes as part of your value estimate, and that will be even in these models, right? There's another type of uncertainty, which I think, isn't there some American vice president? Didn't Cheney say known unknowns and unknown unknowns or something like this? What? Rumsfeld, okay. That native stochasticity is known unknowns, right? Like, you can know perfectly, but still not predict perfectly if the world is stochastic, right? You can also not know perfectly, right? You can also not know what those probabilities are. And then you've got uncertainty in your model itself, right? So if you experience that transition 1,000 times, and 700 of them take you to the same place, then you're really sure the probability is 70%. But if you only experience it 10 times and 7 of them take you to the same place, then it could be 70, it could be 50, it could be 90, you don't really know, right? Yeah.
Cool. You can actually, I have this one, so if you want to just hold on to that microphone.
I've got this one too.
Oh, okay. I'll put this on then. Okay, so with this much more, much greater understanding of Dyna and search to depth, we're going to go forward to revisit this replay data. So basically, what Marcelo and Nathaniel put forward is this idea that the activity during some period called sharp wave ripples, when the animal is at rest, is performing the optimal samples from a model in order to train a value function. So basically, they're performing the correct Bellman backups, they're called. And in order to look at this, they defined two terms, the gain term and the need term. So to revisit, gain term is the one that says, how much does the update I'm going to do affect the policy that I'm actually going to take, affect the policy in the future. So it's basically saying, was my value function super wrong in a place? That's probably where I should do an update. This other term says, how likely are the affected states to be relevant? If the likely states are, or if the states are not likely to be relevant, they're not actually going to be visited in the upcoming future, then you don't want to update them. The idea is that if you discover that some of your value function is really wrong at states that you're probably going to visit in the future, you should definitely update those. Those are the ones to prioritize. If your model's kind of wrong at states you're never going to see, doesn't matter that much. If you're definitely going to see the states, but your model's spot on, or sorry, your value function is spot on, then you're also good. They use this to explain lots and lots of data. This figure was, I think, just the first one is why I grabbed it. But one of the things that their model predicts is that at the beginning, before the animal takes a run through the environment, you see these forward sweeps, which are saying like, okay, I know I'm here, so I'm probably going to go to these states next. These are the ones I should prioritize with my need term. And the reverse replay events that tend to occur after the animal has consumed the reward say, okay, I just got some information about reward, I should update my value function accordingly. We talked a little bit about theta sweeps and also replay, I just wanted to kind of say a little bit about where these fit in with some hippocampal activity. Theta sweeps, the kind that we see this forward precession on in the Johnson and Reddish results, happen when the animal is behaving. It's running through the environment. You see these little patterns of hippocampal activity saying like, I'm going to go this way, I'm going to go this way, I'm going to go this way. It's like something running out in front of it in its simulated memory to anthropomorphize and speculate wildly. And then you also have these events that tend to happen when the animal's at rest and maybe consuming reward, and also happen a ton during sleep. These are the sharp wave ripples I referred to. And what you see, and these also have sequences that are associated with them, that are replayed really fast, faster than the animal actually experiences them. So I think sort of the picture we've painted so far, which is maybe a way people are tentatively thinking about it, although there's a lot of different speculations, is that maybe during rest, the model-based system is training up this model-free system, and online, it's doing these forward rollouts that are helping it choose its behavior right in the moment. So there's sort of a little Dyna perspective and a little rollout perspective. So now we're going to move into a new area of this, which is the question of what these state spaces look like. And I think a point we tried to emphasize is that both model-based and model-free learning systems depend on a representation of state. In model-free, you don't need to know what's going to happen. You don't need to have a model of how you're going to transition in the future, but you at least need to know where you are. And the same is true for model-based, except you also have this additional information of representing how states relate to each other and how your actions live in this space. So now we're going to talk about that a bit. And I should also say, a lot of this RL section, I think people have asked like, oh man, if I got lost at X point in the RL section, am I going to be able to follow what comes next? And I think the way that RL fits into a lot of the upcoming material is that it's more of a motivation for why we want good state spaces than it is a foundational building block. The utility of representing the world in an efficient way that lets you reason over it is beneficial to all sorts of downstream learning processes. Like anything you'd want to do, whether it fits into the RL formalism or not, could benefit from representing structure in a nice way. RL is a formalism that's super popular and has a lot of really nice qualities and can apply to lots of different types of problems and is really popular in RL, and I'm super biased because I work with it. But it's a nice one, and it also really, really suffers when you don't have a good state representation. So it's a good anchor for why we want these, and a good way to say, like, in your grant, like, we need to study this because it'll make RL better, and we know we like RL. But if you have different sorts of things you want to do with a state representation, that's fine too, and I think a lot of this stuff will be somewhat followable without having followed every single word. Okay, so we're in Tolman's era now, and we're trying to understand how the structure that has been exposed by the animal's experience can be used to inform its behavior. So let's say our little mouse friend has taken some convoluted, weird path to get to its cheese, just explored through the environment, meandering as a mouse does, or doesn't, I'm not an experimentalist, to get to cheese. So the next time the animal wants cheese, it has two options, maybe more than two. One is, I can just do exactly what I did last time. I know that it resulted in cheese, just completely mimic the experience path. The other, is to exploit its underlying knowledge of the geometry of the environment to say how it should get to the cheese. So for instance, if it knows how the 2D plane is organized, then it can say, okay, this convoluted path basically just reduces to this vector. And next time I can just take the shortest path because I know how this path relates to a structure I've already seen before, which is 2D space. So both of these are relevant to Tolman. There's this idea of trying to use the experienced paths, which I think is a little bit more to the letter of what he wrote in that quote. But there's also, the whole metaphor of a map implies this underlying geometry that you could be using. This particular maze is kind of trying to capture what we mean by experienced paths. You can imagine the animal taking certain trajectories that are permitted, but that it can't explore the full set of 2D space available to it. It's got these permitted routes. But then if it has more access to the 2D plane, it can use that knowledge. Do you want to add something?
Yeah, maybe I do. So I think, in my mind, there are three things that you can do, right? You can either directly repeat what you did before, if it was good, or you can learn the roadmap. And that's basically what we've been talking about with model-based. You can learn and that's what Tolman did many of his experiments on. But you can also, in space, and actually, as you'll see later in state spaces as well, you can learn the statistics of the space, right, of the roadmaps. And so in two-dimensional space, the statistics of the roadmaps, the average qualities of the roadmaps, let you compute the direct vector, right? Because always in 2D, in every example you've been in two-dimensional space, north plus east plus south plus west got you back to the same place, unless you're on the North Pole. And so those average properties of space, those average relational properties of space, are extremely useful because you don't even have to know the roadmap. You can guess a model before you've ever seen a model, and we'll show you later that that's true in other circumstances as well. And so I like to think of three things. One is not bothering learning a model. One is directly learning a roadmap or a model, and one is inferring a model, guessing a model from your past experiences of the statistics of other models. Yep.
Thanks. Yeah. This is your mic.
Oh, okay. That's what model 3 is.
Yeah. For sure. Okay. So finally, we'll actually talk. We mentioned hippocampus a couple times. Now we'll go through. Maybe you can retrospectively revalue some of the things we mentioned. So a while ago, this idea of a cognitive map was found to be quite literally represented in hippocampus. O'Keefe and Nadell recorded from a rat running around in a 2D environment in this physical space. This is a plot that I took from a later paper, but it kind of illustrates the setup. You have an animal that's running around, and these black lines mark the trajectory of the animal. The red dots, the location of some cells firing. And they found there were a lot of these cells that tended to encode a single location in space. They called them place cells because they encode place. And they wrote a paper, Hippocampus as a Cognitive Map, being like, hey, there's literally a cognitive map right here in the brain. And that's pretty neat. Since then, lots and lots of different cells have been recorded in hippocampus and entorhinal cortex and neighboring areas, and even some not so neighboring areas. Place cells first, and then grid cells later on, which also have these spatial receptive fields, but tend to be multimodal, meaning they have lots of different fields, and they're arranged in a hexagonal lattice. You have cells that encode things like the location of other animals, things that encode head direction, also a very crucial spatial variable. Object vector cells, reward cells, I mean, things that basically encode your position relative to objects, reward, boundaries, the goal direction. There's been a whole, I'm calling them spatial friends. It's also been referred to as like a hippocampal zoo, just like lots of different creatures that are these cells that encode different spatial variables found in this area. And I should have gotten rid of the citation in the corner because these are from lots and lots of different papers, not just this first one. So to go through some of the properties of place cells, as I mentioned, they're found in hippocampus, red in the rat, and also the human brain. They're selective for physical location, and one of the striking properties about them is how they remap. If you take an animal and you put it in some room, you get a smattering of place cells that encode different locations, eventually covering the environment. If you take that animal and you move it to a new room that's sufficiently different, maybe it's got a different position relative to the distal cues in the environment, such as things hanging off the walls of your lab. Maybe it smells different or is a different color. Then you get what's called remapping, global remapping, which is that you essentially get an independent set of cells encoding locations of this environment now. And two cells that fired nearby in one environment might fire in really different locations in a new environment, or one might not fire at all, or they both might fire nearby, but it's a total coincidence. I think this is the most extreme view of global remapping. There's also, there's a lot of recent stuff about how there's maybe a bit more structure to it than that. Yes, please.
Sorry, I don't know if there's issues where did they ever try to change one of the landmarks in the gauge and see if the
Yes, so actually, I mean, these, I went through these quickly, but these object vector cells, they're entorhinal cortex, but they do exactly that. You move an object and they move with it. There's also landmark cells in hippocampus that have this property. I mean, they're all given different names, but basically there's subsets of the population that do seem to encode this.
It basically rotates also.
Yeah.
The whole thing rotates.
So there are situations, you can get, there's various types of remapping, and the most extreme one is called global. It's also the most interesting. So, and global remapping will not happen when you just change a landmark or just change a goal, for example. You have to change the environment. So there's this thing called rate remapping, where the cells fire at the same place, but at different amounts in two different rooms. If the rooms look very similar, that often happens. And then there's another situation where the whole place map kind of rotates around, and somehow as if the animal doesn't know where it is in the room anymore. But in extreme cases, you get this thing called global remapping. It's extremely interesting, and anyone that wants to know more about it should come to my talk tomorrow. It's interesting because it's difficult to understand. So what happens, at least in popular, in sort of the popular mindset, is that the correlation structure between the place cells disintegrates. So that means that if two place cells were near each other in one room, then there's nothing to say whether they'll be near each other or far away from each other in the other room. The correlation between those correlations is zero. That's what is popular mindset, and that turns out to be a rather worrying thing for people who think that a map of space should have constraints, should have two-dimensional topological constraints imposed on it or something like that, because there should be some low-dimensional manifold which is the only one they can live on, because they're in 2D, and so it shouldn't be possible to transfer that to a new set of place cells without some correlations existing. But I'll tell you how that's possible tomorrow.
Wait,
I simulate the place cells by just using combination of landmarks. So I was curious if changing one of the landmarks would look like.
So place cells don't need landmarks, and place cells are only controlled by them. It's certainly true that sensory input has an effect on place cells, although rats can't see very well, so the biggest sensory input that has an effect is smell. And it's absolutely true. And there are these beautiful experiments done in Burgess' lab where he has animals in virtual reality, and so there's two things that can affect what you know in the world. One is something called path integration, and the other is what you can see. And so path integration is I know I've moved 4 that way and 3 this way, so I should be here.
Yeah, we think it's seeing because that's what we use, and the rats.
So the rats used both, and in the grid cells, which we'll find out about in a bit, they're dominated by path integration, by the structure of space. But if you do games where you disentangle those two features, right? And so if you're in virtual reality, you can make vision or smell move faster than the rat is walking on the balls. And then if you do that, you find out that the hippocampus is driven by both of those two things, right?
I'm curious, you can probably only record from a fairly small number of cells. So I'm kind of wondering, like, how much redundancy or overlap, or is it really like one place or a group of cells represent a place?
So a single room in the hippocampus will use about 1 in 3 place cells that you record will be active in only one room. So if you record in 5 or 6 rooms, you'll start seeing the whole population of hippocampal cells represented in place. And so there's clearly redundancy, and there's lots of interesting questions about what features would have to be common in the 2 different places that a place cell fires. If you make the room big enough, it will fire in 2 places in the same room as well. Those are the kind of questions that my lab likes thinking about.
Cool. I actually have a question. You think rate remapping is less interesting than global remapping?
No.
Okay.
I think that it is. I think that you and I should have this conversation later.
Sounds good.
I think that rate remapping probably is just to do with the sensory input changing, right?
Tim, I don't think your microphone's on.
So I think I mentioned. Is this interesting? I don't know.
Well, you mentioned that it's the global remapping is the most interesting kind, so I was like.
So what's happened? So like, I think what's happening in the hippocampus is there's 2 inputs basically. Something about sensory stuff, something about the structural stuff, and then there's also stuff going on in the hippocampus making an attractor in the connections within the hippocampus that make an attractor. If you can't break that attractor, then changing the sensory stuff will cause rate remapping. If you break it, if you change the sensory stuff enough, it'll break the attractor in the hippocampus, and then it will cause global remapping.
Okay.
I think that's what happens.
Yeah, that makes sense. We'll talk that out. Okay, place cells. And then, as we've already referred to before, they participate in these sequences during both sharp wave ripples and theta precession events, which are the subject of a ton of study and very interesting. Grid cells live nearby. They're in medial entorhinal cortex, shown in blue in the rat and human brains. They have, as we showed, spatially periodic fields, and they don't show global remapping, at least not in the way that place cells do. Basically, if you have 2 grid cells that fire nearby in one environment, they're going to fire nearby in another environment as well. You might have a rigid body transformation, which means the whole population maybe shifts its orientation or it's offset from the walls. But basically, the correlation structure remains intact. 2 cells that fire nearby are going to fire nearby in another location as well. So this sort of lends to this notion that place cells are creating this context-dependent, maybe within episode map, where if you have a very different context, or even kind of a slightly different context, or you're in a thing that you want to treat as a separate episode, alluding to this episodic notion of what hippocampus is doing, then you want hippocampus to say these look super different from each other. But if these 2 environments have the same underlying structure, if they're both maybe square environments, or they're both environments that are confined to the 2D plane, or they're basically things where spatial distances work out right, then you want to have the same code to capture this underlying similarity. And this is the low-dimensional manifold that Tim referred to. Is you want something that captures the structure, the fact that they're still in the plane, and mostly the rules are still the same, but you also want something that captures the fact that some things are not the same. Maybe something you learned in this context shouldn't be completely applied to every other time you're in the plane, or maybe really doesn't even fit in that new instance at all. The place cells lend to this very literal idea of a cognitive map, but there's also ways we can go beyond this most literal interpretation. And this is the part where I'm going to hand off to Tim.
Oh.
Sorry. I think I did work.
Yeah, this is Howard Eichenbaum, being a genius, who unfortunately died recently, early. But he demonstrated pretty clearly that these inferences, these geometric inferences that we were talking about, or these roadmap style inferences, were important, was something that relied on hippocampus, and people have taken that into the RL, a model-based RL domain since. The way that he would do it, he calls this, he used to call this property relational memory, and I'll just show you one example of the way he would do it. He had lots of clever ways of doing it. This one's called transitive inference. And so he would train a rat that if he gave them a choice of A and B, then A was the winner. So we would be rewarded for choosing A. And then if he gave them a choice between B and C, that B was the winner. And so B was better than C. And then he would ask them, who's the winner, A or C? And similarly, and so he would argue that if they could choose between A and C, then they've made an inference that they've effectively placed those things on a line, a geometric structure. It's not the geometry of 2D space, it's the geometry of a 1D line, and then they can infer an ordinal structure amongst those things. And similarly, if you go down to a boxing match and see Jane beating up Bob, and then later see Bob beating up Alice, then you clever humans will have no difficulty figuring out that Jane would also beat up Alice, right? And those things are hippocampal. You can find fMRI correlates of them in hippocampus. Darsh Kumran's one example of someone that's done that in both social and non-social domains. But Howard's made some really, really elegant experiments about it. I like this one, where he made lesions either to the fornix. If you lesion the fornix, you remove the frontal input to the hippocampus, or to the entorhinal cortex, which removes all the sensory inputs to the hippocampus. You make either of those two lesions, then the animals can still make the decisions between A and B, or B and C. They can still make the decisions that they've had experience of in the past, but they will perform at chance on the inferred decisions, the ones between A and C. This is really remarkable partly because it's cool, but also because A has actually been rewarded many, many more times than C, right? Because A beat B and got loads of rewards, and B beat C, and so C really hasn't had very many rewards to it at all. And that tells us something that we should think about when designing experiments. It tells us that even if you're thinking about this as model-free RL, you can't think that the states are A, B, and C. The states are A versus B, B versus C. Those are the states they're learning about. They're learning about that, and when you take A out of that context of A versus B, it has not acquired any more model-free value than C did. And so it shows you that the ability to make the concept A, B, and C, and the ability to make the transitive inference that if A is bigger than B, then B is bigger than C, all of that relied on the hippocampus. Okay, and so there are a couple of ways that you might, just like in the Tolman examples that we showed you before, there were a couple of ways that you might think about this. One is stitching together the roadmap. And so here's A, B, B, C, and C, D. And you could make a roadmap out of A, B, B, C, like that, and then you can make a line like that, and that would be making a that would be just equivalent to making a roadmap, and that would be one way of doing this inference, this model-based inference. And the other way of doing it would be, if I got it, yeah, the other way of doing it would be to hold the geometric structure, the low-dimensional geometric structure, the line, in a set of cells like grid cells, and then just like the hippocampus is able to attach new stimuli to different places in a physical map, there's no reason why it can't attach new stimuli to different places on a one-dimensional map. And this is how Howard thought that it worked. I don't think he ever had any evidence that it worked that way, but I think there is now some evidence that it works this way, and I'll present some of it tomorrow. I can carry on. So we, yeah.
So does the second myth depend on there already existing that line?
Exactly, yeah.
From previous experience?
Yeah, just like we have grid cells which encode useful things for learning 2D spaces, I bet we have lots of cells for other useful things in our life. And one of them is a line, because we're always making greater than inferences and less than inferences, and I bet there are other fun ones like social structures and all sorts of representations for hierarchies and that kind of stuff. Yeah. You can, I'm delighted for you to present this next time.
We'll go back to the existing stand-up structure.
I took the wrong water. Thank you.
I actually did mark this one with a little, so we thought, but okay. So basically, that relational information is an idea about how the brain could use geometry to represent things that aren't literal space. The most intuitive example of something geometric. Some evidence for that. I think there's been lots of forms of evidence over the years. One thing that's this really striking, solid evidence came out a couple years ago. From Dmitry Aronov, and they found that putative place cells, pyramidal cells in hippocampus, would encode the frequency of a sound when that was the relevant variable in a task. So completely non-spatial task, animal pushes down a lever, hears a rising tone, boop, and it's trained to release the lever at a particular tone. And the tone can rise quickly or slowly, so just leaving it until a particular time is not a valid strategy for this task. And they find these sequences of hippocampal cells that encode different points along this task. So, or basically, different, sound frequencies in this task. So instead of place, sound is the relevant variable. I should also say, I think it's actually not, each of these lines aren't actually individual cells. I mislabeled this axis. They're just ordered by field. So the same cell can appear multiple times if it had multiple fields. Yeah, I learned that really recently, actually. Yeah, it's actually really common, but it's but yeah, it is what they do. I mean, it's okay. Like, it's the point of this was to show an analogy between place cells and sound-dependent cells, and that still holds, I think, even with that. They also looked at entorhinal cortex, and this is a 1D task, so you can't test for hexagonal structure. You need 2 dimensions to find any hexagons. But they did find these multimodal peaks, or these multimodal receptive fields, kind of winking and nodding in the direction of maybe there'd be grid cells too in a non-spatial 2D task. Then from Tim's lab, there's also an experiment. I guess it would have made sense for you to present this slide. Basically, this study was done with humans and used fMRI to show evidence for the idea that humans use grid-like representations to encode continuous 2D task spaces. So this task is kind of colloquially referred to as the stretchy birds task. There's 2 dimensions these bird stimuli can vary along. You can see their legs getting longer, you can see their necks getting longer. Or you can sample a bird from this space and it has legs of some length or a neck of some length. And what they found using, I think there was objects associated with these, and it was required a pretty clever fMRI setup to do. But essentially the finding is that you have these patterns of activity in the brain that show hexagonal symmetry, which means that if you have trajectories through bird space that are offset by 60 degrees, they look a little bit more similar than if they're offset by something else. And this is a finding that's been observed in different ways of recording averaged activity from entorhinal cortex, and is thought to be reflective of this interaction between head direction and the grid code. So it's basically evidence that people are representing this continuous 2D space the same way they would a physical space. You see the same hexagonal symmetry emerge in a spatial task. Is that, it's always like terror. I think that there's something quite nerve-wracking about presenting somebody else's results just right in front of them. But I'll do that a couple times today, I think, because Nico's also here. Yes?
But then it's not only mediotemporal areas that respond like that?
Yeah, so they also got OFC.
So it's also not only, it's also, have you got my cosine slides here? It's also,
It will take a moment, but yes.
humans have grid cells outside the medial frontal cortex, outside the entorhinal cortex, quite brilliantly. And this was predicted by fMRI, by this wonderful study by Neil Burgess, where he did a similar thing to this, but in real space. You can. There's a whole. Where did I put them?
Yeah, I think I should have prefaced this by saying that this hexagonally symmetric directional signal is also emerges in spatial tasks. That's the analogy.
So, I think I'm sure I did it. Oh yeah, here you go. So here are the spatial versions of it, including this wonderful part of medial frontal cortex, which I think about a huge amount. These are where spatial grids. These are where a spatial grid-like signature appears in fMRI, and then Josh Jacobs went and recorded there and found grid cells there. Nobody's ever found a grid cell outside entorhinal cortex in a rodent, but they have in a human. And so, what are they doing there? I don't know. But that's made me think. These things have made me think that some of these interesting basis functions representing state spaces are in these parts of the brain that have expanded into the frontal cortex in humans, and I think that Nico Shook, who's here, would probably agree with that, because from some of his fMRI results. And so that's why. So I think that medial frontal region is going to be as interesting as the entorhinal cortex for this kind of thing in the future. So there are some grid cells there. Josh Jacobs also recorded grid cells there in humans, so I don't really know the difference between those two brain regions. So I think that posterior parietal one is probably a bit nearer to what you might call an egocentric frame, and so somehow transforming this stuff, it's got connections back into the visual system, which the medial frontal cortex doesn't. But the cingulum bundle just carries a shitload of fibers between those two regions. And so there's it's one synapse between those two regions. Like that loop, like Pape's circuit, whatever you want to call it, Pape's circuit or the default mode network or whatever, that loop just hugs the hippocampus, right? Entorhinal cortex, VMPFC, posterior parietal cortex, retrosplenial cortex, back into hippocampus. Like it just hugs the hippocampus. It sits there modeling the statistics of hippocampal memories. That's what it does, in my view. And all of those places in humans have grid cells have been found in all those places in humans. Yeah.
Yeah.
So sorry. So then is the theory that it's just inheriting grid cells from the hippocampus, or that it's actually maintaining stable fixed points like we were talking about in the hippocampus?
You tell me.
Okay, so yeah, two examples of very non-spatial tasks with spatial-like representations. There's a lot more things like this that have been recorded. You can see visual scenes in non-human primates. They've found that you can kind of get like a grid code over the animal's viewing position. So you've got a monkey looking at a screen, and there's some location it's fixating on. And if you plot the activity in entorhinal cortex, you see some things that are just like grid cells over viewing position, which is kind of neat. They've found evidence for grid-like encodings of social spaces. There's some interesting manifold learning techniques that have been applied to hippocampal data and find that you can get these statistically significant dimensions of your encoding space that even in spatial tasks seem to encode some non-spatial variable, something that like is definitely present in the manifold, but we don't really know what it is. they've looked at 3D space in bats. I mean, this is also spatial, but it's going beyond the plane. And then there's also theories, particularly this paper, Bellman et al. Makes a case for this, that maybe all continuous feature spaces, whether that humans can reason about, will evoke some grid code and are reasoned about accordingly. So there's been a lot of work then in the vein of, yes, please.
I think I probably.
I think I agree with that.
I think I agree with that, and I also. So I don't think that necessarily would. I don't think that necessarily would mean that there will be grid-like codes outside hippocampus. But if you added one thing to that, which is that hippocampus is going to make these rapid associations, and then it's going to pass a loop through entorhinal, learning low-dimensional statistics of those associations, that's great. That then allows it to represent those associations in an efficient manner. Then I would totally agree with what you're saying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think just to add to that, I think like there's some interesting, like the reason that some of these non-spatial stuff was surprising is partly just because, as Tim mentioned, the structured way in which it is represented is non-trivial. The fact that you get encoding of all these variables, maybe that should be expected more. But
it was surprising to John O'Keefe and Edvard Moser and people probably, but it wasn't surprising to Brenda Milner or Howard Eichenbaum or it's just they weren't at all surprised by it. I wasn't surprised. I mean, I was excited by it, but I wasn't surprised by it either. So I didn't quite hear you, but I think you said, is it because it's Euclidean 2D, or and therefore they can treat it and use the same computations? No, what you described to me suggested that. You need to speak louder. I mean, I can't really.
If this is going to go a couple rounds, we should just get him a microphone.
Okay, I feel on the spot now. I was just asking that what you described seemed to suggest that the computations and the implementation of those computations performed in the hippocampus and entorhinal cortex, that it's not enough to say that the same thing happens regardless of modality. It seems to happen in the same way regardless of modality. Whereas if you look at neocortical adaptation, there are reasons to believe that, say, if you were blinded, that perhaps the way that cortical adaptation happens isn't always the same way. The currency is spiking activity and synaptic current, but the pathways by which that activity is mediated may change, and the computational structure of what's going on may be radically different.
I think what you're saying is it requires a really clever fan-in structure to get to map the features, the different sensory features onto the same entorhinal neurons. I agree with that. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. I think one more thing that's about the space versus multisensory modality. One thing that's interesting about these cells, and it maybe is a little bit special about space, even though I think both of us think that hippocampus has this more general role and maybe is applying similar computations to all these different inputs. Spatial receptive fields show up right away, like the animal, especially rodents, right away will start encoding space, which I think one of the reasons this spatial view of it is so prevalent. I think with other cortical mechanisms, there might be this more interesting state inference problem of trying to figure out what's relevant to your task now, rather than just using the defaults that are always relevant.
So I was just wondering about the variance between the active cell and not active cell. Obviously, they're not like active at that location and not active otherwise. Can you enlighten that a little bit more, you guys? And place cells, yes.
Place cells are those two things are different, but you would be amazed, right? And you can go and look at this so place cells almost never spike out of their place field. That's the answer to that question, right? Place cells spike in their place field. They don't even spike very fast in their place field. But real place cells, when you look at if you look at that map that Kim put up earlier, the firing rate, the blue meant 0, right? Yeah, I mean, well, the O'Keefe map.
I don't know if it's worth going back this
The
far.
O'Keefe map would have gone from 0 to 100%. Oh, actually, it's 20 in there, but 20. No, it's not. It is 0. 20 is the start of the little blue one. Yeah. So blue means they really just don't really spike outside of the place field.
Yeah. Although they do have, sometimes place fields will have multiple fields. I
Yeah.
think the view where they have only one field is a little bit cartoonish, but they
And
often they have multiple.
And of course, if the animal isn't running around, if the animal's stationary, then they'll fire outside their place field because there's replays going on, right? But if when the animal's running around, they'll fire in their place fields.
Yes. Can you pass your mic back to him?
I think this goes back to the state inference thing that you just briefly mentioned.
The changing what?
I think my question goes back to the state inference thing that you just spoke about. So, like you said, the place fields come right away, and in the other tasks that you do, which are not spatials per se, but say have 2 dimensions, you kind of see the same thing. Does the animal need to learn that this task has that 2D structure? Or is this like a structure that's available and represented, and you just project onto that, and there's a bunch of different structures available in the brain, and you project onto them? Or is it the case that, so what's the time scale over which in an experiment they're going to actually pick up that structure?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, in Tim's experiments, they trained the subjects on to see like videos of birds changing, which show them the space. And in the tone task, I don't know what the activity looked like during learning. I mean, it's an interesting question, like, are they, do they have priors about how this space should be organized? Like, that neck length and leg length are continuous variables, so maybe you can do this really quickly, but or in theory, but that like hippocampus needs experience to see it. Maybe you can do it really quickly, and hippocampus is like, I got this, I'll just like load in my structure. And maybe it's like coherent with your priors, or maybe you just need to learn this maybe an aliasing or a permutation problem where you say like, I've just seen this new task, but if I label things in this way, it maps onto other structures that are accordingly labeled. Yeah, I don't know. I think the question is like that it's an open question. Maybe you have more specific thoughts on it.
No, I don't know the answer to that.
Okay. Yes.
You showed lots of region with grid representation. I was wondering, do we know what do these regions do when the state space is not in the Euclidean? What if the state space is like a hierarchical structure? Do they still? What do they?
We'll get to that.
Okay.
I think we don't totally know, but we know some things. Okay, sorry. Do we have more questions, or should I? I'll keep going. We'll save Q&A. Okay. Sorry, what's that? Hi.
Hi. Sorry. So maybe this is a silly question, but I'm a little confused about what like the potential null model here would be. Like, so if you just have like if you just assume that these cells have like random convex firing fields according to just some features, and I have some space of 1,000 features that they just could be firing in relation to, so I guess this was inspired by Apurva's question. Is it the case that if you just have a bunch of random fields in this space, and then you just ask, do I have grids in low dimensions? Like, is there just always some convenient low dimensional grid going on according to some subset of the cells?
Kim's going to get there.
Oh, okay. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, it is a good question, as evidenced by or at least I'm going to say it's a good question because it does predict the flow of where these slides are going. Okay, so basically to dive back in, the last slide or two was talking about this idea that we can think about these classically spatially receptive cells as encoding non-spatial or variables as well, either in entirely non-spatial tasks or in spatial and tasks. So there's been, and also that we want to think about going beyond just these 2D continuous spaces and thinking about either higher dimensional feature spaces or maybe just the 3D navigation case for bats. So there's been a lot of work on trying to get more general models of these things. So some of this is in the realm of trying to explain what representations would look like in 3D or ND dimensions. There's an interesting problem that arises from this, which maybe it's a little bit like mathematically specific, but basically you can get a regular packing of the plane with hexagon, or with hexagonal packing in 2D. If you arrange a bunch of fields in this hexagonal pattern like you see with grid cells, that will form this very even and same in every direction representation of 2D space. You don't get that in 3D or higher dimensions at all. 2D is kind of a fun edge case like that. So there's a bunch of different ways you could think about how these spherical fields, if they are going to be spherical, would arrange themselves in 3D, or maybe they won't be spherical, maybe they'll be 2D cross sections. So this paper at the bottom has this theory that you have that grid cells are more inherently 2D. There's anatomical evidence for this and other experimental evidence for this as well. And so maybe what they're just going to do is have a bunch of these different slices through the plane that different grid cells encode, and cumulatively these can represent a higher dimensional space. There's ideas that the crucial element of what drives grid cells is that you have fields that are packed tightly together. So if you try to approximate that in 3D with either hexagonally or close packed or face-centered cubic packing arrangements, that's what you'll get for grid cells. There's ideas that it's kind of messier than that. You just try to take a bunch of spheres and jam them together, and they won't form a perfect lattice because that's hard to find, but they'll be tightly packed together. I think evidence for this is still sort of, any of these is sort of preliminary. And there's been some cool work, I think, from Missoon, actually, right? Where there's evidence for maybe face-centered cubic in humans in this 3D navigation task. With bats, it seems like they're sort of just like spheres that like to keep some spacing from each other, but I think that from Ulanovsky lab, Gilly's presented on this a few times, but it's all like really preliminary. I probably shouldn't even talk about it in a tutorial. But I think it's really interesting future direction, which is why I wanted to flag it. Then there's the question, I mean, going into higher dimensional Euclidean spaces is one way to think about how we would generalize these grid cells. Another one is to talk about spaces that have a really different notion of geometry altogether. Higher dimensional Euclidean is basically taking something where distances still sort of work the same way as they do in 2D space, but you just have much more dimensions to it. So here's an illustration of a 3D continuous space. You can have 4D or 10D or much higher dimensional if you want to. I think my heuristic for thinking about what a Euclidean space is that they're named after Euclid, who was just this guy who was like from thousands of years ago. So he was doing geometry before any fancy math was invented. So it's going to be the intuitive kind of geometry. 2D Euclidean geometry is all of the geometry you learned about in grade school. Things like parallel lines never intersect each other. The sum of the angles of a triangle add up to 180 degrees. The Pythagorean theorem. All of those things are true for 2D Euclidean space. Non-Euclidean space have fancier rules associated with them. They can be manifolds that maybe locally look like Euclidean space, but if you zoom out, it's folding itself into this weird knot. Yes? Sorry, did somebody say, excuse me? Oh, okay. Okay, never mind. I'm hallucinating mildly. And then graphs, which we're going to talk about a lot more, will have this structure where you have a bunch of nodes, which are shown as circles there, and they're connected to each other with what's called edges. Understanding, I think we're going to talk about graphs a lot in the future. We won't talk about manifolds that much, so if terms like locally Euclidean just sound like mathematical nonsense, I think that's fine for now. It's just a good thing to know that some of these methods can extend in that direction in case you want to ask questions about it or think about it further. For graphs, something about this picture might look a little familiar. We sort of informally illustrated a lot of the problem spaces we set up as having relations between them. So as these relate to how we would model tasks, you can think of every state that the animal can occupy, or agent, as some node in this graph, some little circle there, and edges might connect states that can be, that have actions linking them. There's been some work looking at how hippocampus encodes spaces that have this more graphical, discrete structure. And this gets to your question, I believe. So one of these results was done by Anna Shapiro when she was a grad student. Basically, they showed subjects these sequences of fractals. I don't know if you can quite see, but each of these nodes in this graph is associated with some fractal that the subject is shown. And they're given some tasks. They're asked questions about the fractal. I think they were asked to say if it looks like the fractal is facing up or sideways. And unbeknownst to the subjects, these fractals were progressing according to a structured order. And this was that they were moving through this task graph. So that means if you're at an orange node and seeing a fractal that's associated with that orange node, you're most likely to move to an orange node next. And these colors are just added for illustrating the figure. They weren't actually seeing orange, or you would have something immediately exposing the structure, which you don't want. And what she found is that hippocampus and also other areas of medial temporal lobe and the executive network seem to reflect this, what's called community structure, that nodes that tend to be interconnected to each other have similar representations in hippocampus and other areas of the brain. So the plot showing this is this one in the bottom left corner, where what they did is they looked at the representation of each fractal in hippocampus, and they correlated these patterns together. And then they did something called multidimensional scaling. Whoops, what did I do? Okay. Multidimensional scaling to see how these distances could be captured if you forced it into a 2D plot. And what you see is that the representations of orange states tend to be near each other, but further away from green and purple, and that green tends to be closer to green, purple closer to purple. So basically, anterior hippocampus is reflecting this community structure that's present in the graph. Yes, please.
So just to confirm, there was no relationship between those patterns other than they were shown before or after each other?
Yeah, the fractals were selected in order to not have anything about the event structure captured within them. It was, if there was similarity, it would have been entirely incidental. The thing that links them is their temporal associations rather than anything immediately apparent about the stimulus to the subjects. Yeah.
Maybe you just kind of answered it, but they're also close in time, right? That's what I was wondering, like, because there was other work by Doller and whatever, where they navigate a virtual environment and things that are physically closer together as well as temporally closer together but physically distant have similar representations. So how do you disentangle those two things here?
Yeah, I mean, so I think that the paper you referred to, the paper from Doller Lab, does work towards disentangling that. So I mean, previously what we had was results showing that two things nearby in space, and also nearby in time, because usually two things that are nearby in space, you move quickly between them, will look similar to each other. In this, we have an entirely non-spatial task. All you have is this temporal structure that's present in it. In this study from Christian Doller's lab, I think Decker was the first author. What they looked at was a virtual navigation task where you decoupled travel time from actual physical distance in space. And the way they did that was introducing these teleportation hubs, which they can do because it's virtual reality, and also detours. So maybe two things nearby in physical space you could only get to through a long detour, and maybe two things that were far away in physical space actually had really close in terms of travel time because they could just go through the teleportation hub. And in this, they found effects of both space and time. There's sort of these, both of the effects of this are captured in hippocampus, which is kind of interesting. It's evidence for the fact that both like the geometry of space is encoded in this somehow, as well as these local transition structures. I don't remember if I have a slide on this, but I might have some modeling results that refer to it later. Cool. So this is a new paper, again from Tim's lab, showing that closer elements in the graph have more similar representations to each other. And this is also a discrete task space where subjects are shown these objects that, again, as you can see, have no relation to each other in terms of what the objects look like, but are embedded in this graph such that things can be nearby in this transition structure without having any nearby representations. And they found that there was this effect where closer elements in the graph tended to have more similar representations to each other, suggesting that this transition structure was encoded in the graph. I think there's something else you wanted to say about this, too, that I'm not saying right now.
It's fine.
Okay, maybe it'll come up in your talk tomorrow. Cool, so then there's the question of how we think about this mathematically. A lot of the ways we think about space don't necessarily transfer in a super straightforward way to these other domains. And so we want to try and get a more general framework for talking about them. And this is how we get to those states and transitions that we were talking about earlier, where you can think of each of these discrete elements in these graphs as a state. It's a little more abstract than just a location in physical space, and transitions as things that link nearby things. So rather than being literally nearby in space, you can have transitions that join things. In this graph, recall that each of these blue things were referring to states. They're not physical locations, but they refer to your position in this task structure. And one way that we can encode this is something called a one-hot vector. Basically what I just did is I took all these states and I listed them in a row. We're going to have our representation be a vector, where each element in the vector is going to correspond to one of these states. So let's say you're in this location. You're going to have a vector now where you left one element free for each possible state. And at the state you're currently at, you're going to put 1 in that vector. And at all of the other states that you're not at, you're going to put 0. So this is a very explicit representation of location in a way that can apply to any kind of task you might have. It might seem almost a little bit silly, like why are you leaving all those states open? You could just represent a number, like I'm at index 1 or I'm at index 3. But we have some reasons for doing it this way. Now, if we move to a new location, your one-hot's going to change too, to reflect that you're now at this other location. So if you look at all of the possible locations you have, these create the identity matrix, where you have the representation of state n is just a vector with 1 at state n and 0 everywhere else. So one of the reasons to go through expressing things in this way is that it links up to place cells a little bit. You can think of each place cell as encoding some location in space, and the place cell fires when the animal's at that location and doesn't fire when it's not. And this is a kind of abstract code for location that we could start thinking about applying to these other tasks as well. So that slide said, remember states and transitions. Now we're going to get to transitions. There's been quite a few modeling works that are trying to look at how grid cells can be explained, not just from, I'll answer your question in a second, not from something about space. For instance, like how you would arrange spheres in space relies on having a notion of spatial geometry, but rather just looking at transition structure, looking at how adjacent states are connected to each other, and then trying to see if I have a good, efficient code of that information, to what extent do grid cells emerge. And there's been a couple different works exploring how this would emerge in different ways of structuring your agent or the statistical extraction process. I'll go into some of these a little bit more later. They're all sort of like related to each other, but taking different approaches and sometimes with different constraints. So I'll take your question now, and then I assume I'll probably have some questions about this one too.
Thank you. I just want to make sure I got this. So the state is, you've got a bunch of variables. They've each got a value. You give each variable an axis and the values simultaneously. That's your state. And you're going to map that to some more efficient representation, or that's it.
So if you, I mean, what Kim was saying in that second slide, which may not have been so obvious, was if you take a state representation and then you map out not just, so if you map out which state is which cell, you've got the identity matrix. If you now make it state by state, a matrix, and you say which state is next to which other state. And you could do that in two ways. You could either make a transition matrix for an RL problem, or you could just take some place cells and compute the correlation between all the place cells so the neighboring ones will overlap. And so you get a nice correlation matrix. And if you do anything like that, then you'll end up with something which is like a banded matrix, right? So it'll look a bit like a it'll look not like the identity. It'll have stuff off the identity like a band. So neighboring states whose neighbors are also likely to be neighbors of others of their neighbors. So you get like a band, and that reflects the two-dimensional structure of space. Right, the elements in that banded matrix.
Topography preserving.
And the topology, yeah, exactly. And so embedded in the fact that these things are next to each other is the two-dimensional structure of space. And if you just take the eigenvectors of those matrices, any of them, you get grid cells. So a low-dimensional representation of the fact that you're in a two-dimensional space gives you grid cells.
So just one more question. So you explicitly got dimensionality reduction into that 2D space that preserves topography.
So that matrix, let's say you've got let's say you've got 100 states. That matrix is 100 by 100. Then you take the eigenvectors and you look at the first 20 or something. There are loads of grid cells in there. But that's the concrete fact. I mean, how you want to describe that? I don't know how you want. That's the concrete fact. Yeah.
Thank you.
I think I'll also, I'm just showing a bunch of different results, and the thing that here, and the thing they have in common is that they're extracted from transition structure and the overlap of adjacent place cells. I'll go into some of these in more detail. I think I even have some slides that are illustrating this dimensionality reduction process. The only reason I'm being vague now is because these models also have a bunch of differences among them, and I want to say like only the thing they have in common. But that might be like, that is a little bit, being a little bit vague about them. But hopefully that element will.
But somehow the grid, somehow those cells are encoding the transitions between states, and they look like they do because it's a 2D space that they are trying to represent.
So can you let me know when it's been an hour since the last break?
Well, we probably want, are we about halfway through the second? I think
plus minus.
I think we want to go a little bit, otherwise the last session will be really long.
Agreed.
Probably has been.
Okay.
Is everyone really knackered? Or can we wait?
That means tired for Americans.
So, like, I think we haven't. I think we should go on 15
Yeah,
more minutes.
this isn't really a great breaking point, but if people are starting to fall asleep, just kind of like, I guess, just very visibly fall asleep, like snore loudly, give me some indication. Thanks. All right. So again, I want to show this remapping slide and show how this fits in with this new information. We have the one hot vectors we showed, we're just encoding every state uniquely, and importantly, arbitrarily. There's nothing special about the state that we named 1 that makes it state 1. We just gave it a random cell that's going to fire for it, and it's not really fundamentally different from some other cell that's going to fire from state 46. It's an arbitrary mapping, and it's very unique and sparse. And then in a new context, we're going to have another completely arbitrary mapping that's also unique and sparse. It's just like we randomly named these things, and now we're going to randomly name them different things in another environment. The cells that we assign to them say nothing about their position with respect to the structure. These grid cells capture position with respect to structure in a way that's much more standard across environments. So something that is extracting the statistics of transition structure or dependent on the statistics of transition structure, what we mean by that is that it's reflecting the position relative to a bunch of other states in the environment too. So states that look the same with respect to the grid code have some function, some structural element in common. Although states that maybe look the same or look different with respect to the place code in different environments, that's an incidental relationship. To transition into the next section, one of the other ways that people have started thinking about hippocampal and entorhinal representations is how they might relate to a downstream learning process, such as reinforcement learning. If they're not just for spatial navigation, then what are they for? How can we think about what these representations are useful for? And one idea has been to connect them to reinforcement learning and think about how the way that space is represented in navigation tasks might be an efficient way to represent it for some downstream process. Gustafsson and Daw was an early paper taking this approach, where they looked at the representations in grid cells and in place cells as providing a basis for a downstream learning process, that would be really helpful. And we'll go into more detail later on why certain representations are useful and why certain aren't. But to give a quick intuition now, one thing place cells do is they'll fire at one location and also less at nearby locations. So they start to create a very smooth representation of space. And one feature of the model that these guys put forward is that they're geodesic place cells, which means they don't go over boundaries. They respect shortest path distances rather than like actual position in space, which means if there's a wall separating location 1 and location 2, a place cell that fires on one side of the wall is probably not going to fire on the other side of the wall, even though in some sense they're nearby in space, because the shortest path joining them is actually still pretty long. And this is a nice way to represent value, because you don't want, if you find reward on one side of a wall, you don't want to think that the state next to the wall is also valuable, because you actually have to go through this pretty long path to actually get to reward. What you want is to have some sort of smoothness about your spatial structure represented, so that all the locations that are actually nearby look nearby, and you can tell this to your downstream learning process. And we'll go through more concretely how that information is transferred in upcoming slides. And those upcoming slides are right now. So basically, this is the question that we've sort of been driving towards, is like, how do you want to represent your state in a way that makes these reinforcement learning processes that can be kind of hard easier? And this is when we get to Harlow, making better state spaces, getting better state spaces to make downstream learning easier. That way, when you see a similar task the second time, you can learn it a lot faster. You can also think of this as the question of what form should S take. So in all of these functions, S is a variable. Your transition structure depends on your state, your reward function, and your value function. You need to tell it what state you're in order for it to tell you how valuable that is or what transitions are available to you. And so in all the previous examples, state was just an index or a one-hot, which is basically the same as an index. It just told you, you're in this state, you're not in any other states. But we can actually represent state in a more complicated way that has a lot more information bundled into it, which then the downstream reinforcement learning process inherits. So for instance, if we see this traffic light, there's a bunch of options we have for how we can represent it, and that'll make learning easier or harder. We could just represent it as a one-hot. The light is red, it is not green, and it is not yellow. We could just represent it as the color red, or just the word red, and anything else that is also red will be represented similarly. We could say, hey, that's a traffic light, and just not any other information, which wouldn't be super helpful. We could say it's a red light at 11 in the morning. That way we know, like, oh, we should actually stop at this red light. If it's 3 a.m., like, meh, who cares? And we could just represent it as itself, just full pixels, just like every single pixel is represented in this traffic light, and we haven't compressed it at all or extracted any information about it. We're just trying to learn over raw pixels, which is what a lot of deep learning approaches do, which, as you might guess, is really, really hard to do. You have to learn about how each of these pixels individually relates to your reward eventually. If you had to learn about how pixel number 12 in your picture of a traffic light related to reward, you would get into a lot of accidents and probably die before learning how to drive. Yes, please. Yeah.
But you build latent variables first, right?
Yeah, so we spend our whole lives learning what to do with the pixels we receive. So I mean, I guess not pixels, but like your retinal encoding of a cells. You get this information in an extremely raw format, but then over the course of your entire life, you spend time training a visual system to know how to map your raw visual input onto concepts that can make learning happen faster. And that's sort of the point here, is that like once you have enough to know that a pixel maps into an object and it has certain sections that are different colors, then somebody can tell you what those different colors mean, and then you can use that to build your behavior, rather than having to learn about driving all the way from raw inputs together.
So people in Nico's lab, for example, who's just turned up, spend their whole life working out how to get pixels into objects, but then you've got a whole question about how you organize those objects to make useful states for learning about behavior, and those two systems have to interact somehow, because you want to make the best objects. Like, what is an object? Like, it's a deep philosophical question. Effectively, it's things that are useful for your behavior as independent, separate things, and the visual system should learn to transform pixels into those things that are independently useful. It's a complicated problem, but that's that's part of the problem of state representation. There are other parts of it too.
Yes.
So being in the decision process framework, we assume that the transitions are Markov, right? And in the DQN setting, you concatenate frames in order to create that Markov before you start the recursive frame, right? And so my question is essentially how do you disentangle learning the state representation which allows for Markov, or is Markov even necessary for reinforcement learning in a biological plausible?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, well, I think we have some later sections that get to that point a little bit more. I think the way we're going to set it up, just as a foreshadowing, is that you can think of it as if for instance your full observation doesn't determine what's going to happen next. Maybe sometimes you see a red light and you're going to do one thing, sometimes you see it and you're going to do another. Then you have what's called a latent state, what's often formalized as a latent state, which in your brain differentiates these. So that some downstream learning process can just say, like, use the Markov assumption. But it's part of the problem of state representation learning is to get a representation that can be Markov in a lot of these formulas. You could also think about it not being Markov.
I just wanted to express this question in a way that everybody is going to understand in the room, because I think it's an important question. So the question is about the fact that we've assumed a Markovian property, which means that we've assumed that the world as it is now can predict the world as it will be in the next time step, independently of what happened before, right? If you knew everything about the world now, then you could predict what was going to happen one time step ahead, and you didn't have to remember anything from a long time ago. That's what Markov means. And everything we've told you today, it makes that assumption. That assumption is obviously true for the world itself if you have complete information. I think it would take some philosopher to say that isn't true if you knew everything about the world. But on top of that, we have a new problem, which is that we don't know everything about the world. And so conditioned on what we know, the world may not be Markov. For example, we might not know that somebody is in the next door room doing. What's a good example of something we might not know? We might not know that the rules of the traffic are different at night time than they are in rush hour, for example. Those kinds of things will make the world not Markov to us, right? Because some car might be less likely to move into the bus lane in one situation at 6 o'clock at night than they are at lunchtime, because the rules are different. If we don't know that, we would need two different transition matrices for two different worlds, and so that isn't a non-Markov situation, right? If you have to change your transition matrix at two different time points. And so the way to solve that is to try to find out all those different types of situations. There's two ways that there's two tricks our brain has to solve that. One of those tricks is to try to separate those situations into ones that make them Markovian, like building latent states, like the state of it being rush hour versus, and then modeling different transition matrices in those different situations. Another trick that our brain has is to have a memory of things that happened a very long time ago. And now you only have to be Markov conditioned on your memory, right? And then that then makes things a lot easier. But yeah, I just wanted to re-express the problem.
Thanks, yeah. Show of hands, who does not know what the word Markov means, if you feel comfortable admitting that? Okay, no. Everybody knows now. Okay, cool. Because that is a word we sort of just used a lot and forgot to define. Okay, yeah, so lots of choices of how to represent your current state. In our other MDP we saw earlier, there's this, we decided to just make poor and unknown, poor and famous, rich and unknown, rich and famous, the different states you could occupy. But like, why did we pick those? We could have picked other things. We don't know necessarily what's actually relevant to the RL process. That was a natural choice, but maybe if you're poor and famous and in your office, Or if you're poor and famous and named Steve, or poor and famous and you wrote the string in a fancy font. Like maybe these could all be part of your state representation that you're trying to learn about. And it's a hard problem to figure out what's actually relevant to your state as your behavior should depend on it further on. So the form of S affects the complexity of learning your value in a model-free setting or your reward function and transition matrix in the model-based setting. And this is a thing I'll assert now and illustrate later. And just, yeah, this is both model-based, model-free thing. When I say the word state representation, I'm referring to a choice of like one of these sections. I just wanted to have a thing that reminded me to define that explicitly because it's a word that'll come up. Cool, so I guess this is a fairly long, how long have we been going? Because this is a fairly long section and I'm worried people are tired. Okay, yeah, we'll do a quick break.
Yeah, we'll break, we'll meet up again in 20 minutes.
Also, I'm tired. So where did we leave off? We left off talking about how there was a lot of options in how we could choose how to represent our state. And that we have some difficult learning problem as to how to do it. So we're going to talk a little bit about how learning works with different state representations. Basically, you all remember how we set up the reinforcement learning problem. We're going to go through a couple examples of what it looks like to have different state representations that you're using to learn. So here's a really classic reinforcement learning problem, the two-armed bandit problem. You've got two slot machines. They're both differently rewarding. It's not just like a casino thing where they're totally random and you can't win. You know some are going to be better than others, and you want to figure out which one you should take. So you do this by just sampling them a couple times. You get some reward. You get some disappointments. Eventually, you learn a value function which says how valuable is each of these bandits. Each bandit is going to be a separate state in this problem for now. Once you have a lot more states, this problem gets a lot harder. So in this case, we're drawing it a little differently. We now have four different slot machines. Each one's labeled by a different color. And now it's going to take a lot longer to learn about them just because you have more things to learn about. Unless there's some latent structure in the world that you can use to make your learning process more efficient. So instead of learning about 4 individual bandits, maybe you can learn about some shared structure they have. For instance, maybe these are changing over time, but nearby in time, all bandits will have the same value. Then you know you don't need to worry about which bandit you're looking at. You just think about how things are going in your particular time course. You might observe something like the red bandits all tend to have the same reward. You might observe something, I guess in this case, when you see something like the color is the thing that affects the reward, or the position on this x-axis is the thing that affects reward, then you know that you don't need to learn about each bandit individually. You can just learn about the whole set of them together. So this is basically the problem of how you're going to represent your state. One example I like for this, because it's just, it's not rodents, not humans, it's a different animal altogether, are these fish called sticklebacks. And the male sticklebacks have this quality where they'll attack other red male sticklebacks in order to defend their territory. And they've done experiments and shown that the thing that the stickleback is actually paying attention to is just the color of the underbelly of the other fish. So when the experimenters put in this really photorealistic example of a fish, this like perfectly crafted all-white fish, the male stickleback is very unimpressed. It just sort of floats around doing its thing. But as soon as you insert any blob, no matter how not fish-like it looks, that's approximately the right size, if it's got red on the underside of it, that fish will go crazy on it because it thinks it's a male stickleback, because the only thing that's relevant to its representation of state is the color of the underbelly. And this leads to some fairly ridiculous behaviors in the experimental setting, but in the actual world, I guess this is a pretty decent heuristic because there's a whole bunch of male sticklebacks, and females for that matter. So another example that I want to illustrate is when you don't necessarily have structure in the space of properties of your bandits. So it's not necessarily something like color or position on this x-axis, but rather structure in your transition space. So structure maybe in the way the environment is structured. And you can use this in order to explore more efficiently, and learn more efficiently. So in the learning model we set up before, maybe you remember Tim's example of the states all connected in a line. If you're going to go through this environment and learn which states are valuable, then you end up backing up value in a similar way. You first have to experience one reward, then the state that predicts it, then the state that predicts that, then the state that predicts that, and then eventually you know what to do at your actual decision point. The reason this seems kind of silly is that if you look at this structure, you know there's this pattern you can extract, which is that all the states on the same arm have to be visited in some sense together. So if you learn that there's a fruit loop at the end of your left arm, you can just say, I guess this arm is pretty good, rather than worrying about how good each state is within that arm. And you can apply a similar generalization over states within one room. You have the same thing with exploration. Exploration, as we set it up, is sort of just synonymous with randomly choosing from the available actions. So if I'm at the center of this Y maze and I'm just randomly picking actions, it's going to do something kind of stupid. It's going to go a little to the left maybe, back to the right some more, and eventually you will explore this whole environment, but it's a stupid way to do it. It just seems very silly. And I should say that these are actually kind of similar to what we have artificial agents doing all the time. Like a lot of the impressive machine learning results you read about are doing things that are this level of stupid, but you just have so much data that you can train something really complex eventually to do really, really intelligent behaviors. And that's kind of a cool thing. You don't need to set up something really clever. You can just have a whole lot of data and a very sophisticated, or at least agent that has a whole ton of parameters, and they can do something quite clever, even though if you look at the behavior, it's certainly not clever in the way people and rats are. Once again, you can decompose your environment in the same way, or split up your states in the same way, and just check arm 1 and then check arm 2 for your exploration, or check each room. And things like check arm 1 and then check arm 2, or check each room, imply some structure to the exploration, but you could also just be randomly picking over your actions once again. But once you've organized the environment into separate arms or into separate rooms, randomly choosing is not so bad anymore. Because now I'm randomly choosing an entire arm rather than just one state at a time. So I won't have all this dithering. I'll go down the entire arm and see how that goes. Maybe I'll randomly choose that arm again and that'll be a waste, but there's so many fewer options that it's much better. You can still do something really simple and get pretty good behavior. So now we want to set up what it actually will look like a little bit more formally to use features to explore. When we learned about value over states, we could basically just think of it as having a table. Each state had a different value we were learning about, and then we could say, what state am I in, look up the right value, and then behave accordingly. In this case, we're doing something that's called function approximation, and it lets us reason over features rather than reasoning on the basis, oh my God, thank you so much. Thank you. I'm sorry, this is rude of me because I know you don't have coffee, but I'll try and return this in energy with bouncing a little bit. All right, so we're going to learn in a representation space first. So let's show what we mean by that with this same toy example. We're going to take our Y maze, and we're going to select two features about this Y maze that correspond to these color groupings. The x-axis is going to be, am I on arm 1 or am I not on arm 1? The y-axis is going to be, am I on arm 2 or not on arm 2? And we're going to do what's called projecting these states into this space based on how they express these features that we've defined. So if something's way down arm 1, it's going to be way down the x-axis. If it's way down arm 2, it's going to be way down the y-axis. Now, when we learn about this state, when we learn that there's a fruit loop at it, then we're not just learning about that one state, we're learning about this whole arm. Because we're learning about the x-axis, not learning about individual states. We're expressing things by where their position is in this space, and then if two things are nearby, then they're going to be learned about together. We're basically learning weights on these features, what's called. So if I learn that arm 1 is valuable, I have a higher weight on the arm 1 feature. Everything that's a little bit on arm 1 is going to get a little boost as well. We can use this same space to generate exploratory behaviors. So let's say we have these actions. We think this is a good organization of our task structure. I'm going to have one exploratory action that's just go all the way down arm 1, try and max out this feature, and that's going to have me see a lot of the relevant value space according to what I've decided I think is relevant. Or I'll maybe go all the way down arm 2 and try and explore as much variability in this dimension that I think is relevant. Okay, yeah. So, sorry, these are in a different order than I thought. The representation space that we set up there was a pretty good one. You can also have a representation learning space that's really bad and actually makes learning a lot harder. So in the first case, we just were learning about states one at a time. It was inefficient, but it was fine. In the next case, we had an organization of the environment that made learning happen a lot faster. It automatically took the information about reward and shared it with everything that should get updated by that reward. In this case, we're going to take an embedding that's just kind of crappy. We're going to say if you're an even state or an odd state, that's going to be one feature. And your distance from the decision point is going to be another feature. So we start mapping the transition structure in this way. If we now learn that there's some fruit loop at the end of this arm, then we're learning about things that are really far away from the decision and also things that are odd. And that's not really a great way to generalize. If you look at all the states that got updated here, they're updated in a really confusing way that doesn't even tell the animal which way it's supposed to go next. It just looks entirely symmetric because both arms are represented the same, and also alternating doesn't really make sense as a way to structure this. So the takeaway is that you want to group states together that share information. It's what we call generalizing. If we can learn something about state A, and that's general to all states that share some property with A, then we call that generalizing over all of these states. We'll generalize A to everything else that shares properties with A. You also want to be sure to separate states that do not, you don't want to treat as similar, that could have really different values to you. So the purpose of grouping states that generalize is that you make your learning problem a lot faster. You can learn about 1 state, 2 states, 10 states all at the same time. But if you learn about lots of states all at the same time that actually should be treated really different, then you don't give yourself as much flexibility as you want to. You don't want to learn about all the odd states together because that doesn't let you differentiate states that are both odd but maybe should be treated really differently. There's also this notion of latent states, which gets into a lot of the questions we heard about whether or not something should be Markov. We can see that in a lot of these tasks, the observations that you're seeing aren't really sufficient to disambiguate what you should do next. And in this case, there's evidence that humans and also rodents infer latent states. And basically, even though the observation they're seeing doesn't tell them what they should do next, there's something in their brain that does encode this abstract variable. So there's some ideas from Bob Wilson, Yael Niv, about how OFC might be used to infer latent states and the connections among them. There's some cool recent work from Nico, who's here, and with Yael Niv about how you can decode replay among these latent states from hippocampus using this task where you have a bunch of different stimuli that you see, but how you treat them depends on where you are in the task space. I would go into this, I was planning to go into this in more detail, but with the time I probably will just go on. And then there's also some work about inferring latent causes. And in this kind of formalization of the problem, there's this prior that you have these latent causes that tend to be temporally extended. So you're kind of in the same cause for a while, but they have really discrete event boundaries between them. So if something changes all of a sudden, that's when you should say, like, oh, I'm in a discrete or different latent state. And these, importantly, are not states that are being told to you by the environment. They're being told to you by the rule structure, how you're going to behave based on these features that you're observing. And that's how you can start to be able to behave appropriately, even when you need additional information that's not immediately obvious to you from what you're looking at right this second. The way this is captured in rodents, or at least one way that you can see this, is that if you have a task such as an alternating T-maze, where the animal has to go left, and then right, and then left, and then right, when the animal is in the central channel, what it's looking at is not necessarily indicative of what it should do next. The physical location in space doesn't tell it what to do next. It's physical location plus some element of history, plus some element of the rule structure right now. When animals learn this task, this information becomes reflected in the hippocampal code. You get what's called hippocampal splitting, where a cell that originally fired in just some location in the center of this maze will now fire in the center only when the animal's on one trajectory or the other. So maybe you get place plus I'm about to go right, place plus I'm about to go left. Cool. So one of the things to think about with this problem of picking a good representation is this trade-off of how much information you want to capture and how much you want to ignore. So we set this up in some of the, in that Y maze example, where you had one representation that automatically grouped things according to things that they share, and one that grouped things according to some other more arbitrary metric. And before you get into a task, you don't necessarily know what's going to be relevant. In order to learn that task as quickly as possible, you want to start off with a really good state representation that's reflecting relevance by these proximity relations, but you might not know what to do ahead of time. And you have this trade-off before you get into a task of how much information you should represent. So maybe, to explain this diagram a little bit better, what you're receiving is this raw sensory input, which is super high dimensional and contains lots of unprocessed information. This traffic light, for example. You have this representation problem first, where you want to say, how am I going to encode this in the brain? Maybe just as this cartoon traffic light. You don't need to know any things about the daytime, or like maybe if it's an old-timey traffic light or an English traffic light versus an American traffic light. And then on top of this representation that you've extracted, maybe based on your exposure to lots and lots of objects and lots of instances of seeing raw sensory input in the world, on top of that representation, you're going to do a learning process, such as model-free or model-based RL, or maybe some other reasoning process that you want to do with this information. So maybe like stomp on the pedal or steer or whatever you think you should do next. So you could encode this in an even more compressed way, get rid of the colors and just say, this is index 1 of my state representation, or index 2 or index 3. And when you do it this way, you have a lot less work for the RL system. It's a much lower dimensional representation. You don't have things about color or what color the background of the traffic light is. You just have this very relevant information. But the risk is that if you decide on this ahead of time, you might be getting rid of some information that would be really valuable later on. So at the other end of this extreme, you could have a really unprocessed representation that's not that compressed at all. This gives you a lot more work in your particular task for the reinforcement learning agent. But it's less compressed and also gives you a lot more flexibility. So if maybe I want to ask something about, if maybe I want to do different things at different points in time during the day, having, for instance, the fact that the sky is light blue instead of black might be relevant information for that. And when I originally learned to drive, I didn't think I would make decisions like that. But now that I know how to drive, I want to start incorporating more variables, and having this information is bad. I feel a little bit bad that my recurring example is how you should run red traffic lights at nighttime. Don't do that. It's definitely bad, unless you live in the particular suburb I grew up in which case it's totally fine and don't worry about it. So at the extreme end of this spectrum, we have something called end-to-end learning, which is where you have, in some sense, no representation at all. You're just going directly from your raw observation to the output that you want. And this is a pretty complicated learning process, but if you've got a big fat neural network, you can do it. You've got enough parameters that you can fit a really complicated mapping from each pixel and how they might be arranged in your scene to this value function or policy at the end of your neural network. One example is to set up a convolutional neural network to learn to play video games, which people have done. And this is a great domain for training something like this because you have as much data as you want. You can just keep running video games until the end of time. You also don't have to run them in real time. You can run them way faster than a human would experience them, which is one of the reasons these video game AIs are so far ahead of robotics. And this network basically will learn this complicated mapping, and then you're kind of done. You don't need to worry about it. Another way you can think about what this is doing is that each level of this is learning a representation. You're learning many representations that allow the downstream part of the network to figure this out. So you can kind of think of this as no representation in some sense. You're going from raw observation directly to output. But in a way, each layer is kind of learning the representation that allows the rest of the network to compute the relevant aspects of the computation. I think the thing that's special about this setup is you don't have any additional things saying what should be in a representation besides just what you're trying to do downstream. You're not saying I'm going to capture everything that's red or I'm going to do something unsupervised. It's just saying, I'll let reinforcement learning tell me everything I need to know. Yes, please.
One quick note, they will never start with, I made this myself actually, and you would never start with deep convolutional network. You would start with a pre-trained deep convolutional network. So you would only train the last fully connected layer. And you would already have a lot of knowledge about the world in the first layers. So you would not go from raw data to...
Sure, so if you do something like that, then you're doing something more like one of these processes. So what he was saying is that it would be crazy to start from scratch on a new visual classification task or a learning task where I needed to say, is this, our picture, maybe For example, pictures of cups are really good and pictures of dogs are really bad. This is the reward structure I've set up for some reason. Learning to classify an image as either a cup or a dog, like a naturalistic image, is a really hard problem. So you would never just start from scratch and say, I'm going to learn how to do this, because we already have networks that are pre-trained to do object classification. So you can apply this network, get an object label out at the end, and then just do learning over that. And that's exactly what this process depicts here. Except for instead of some blue arrow that just turns things into one-hots, you have a neural network that's doing the computation in this blue arrow. You may also have a neural network that's doing the RL process on top of this representation. These arrows, I didn't add any more structure to them because you can fit in whatever structure you want. You can stick neural networks to do them, or you can use something that's more like these explicit state naming processes that we referred to earlier. Does that capture your comment? I mean, a lot of times you totally could just train up an RL agent to do the dog and object thing. It might do it. What's that? Yeah, but you often have you do have an insane amount of data. So
the people doing video games don't do this. They don't build an internal representation. They don't use a pre-trained network. They train it from scratch.
Oh yeah, but the race example, they use pre-trained race networks.
So I think.
In this paper?
But you would almost never, you would never just hook up an untrained deep neural network, but unless you have at least a couple of million.
Yeah, but you often, yeah, I guess you often do is the thing. And a lot of the time, there's basically like some amount of debate as to whether or not when you do have that amount of data, it's more like morally pure in some sense to just train it end to end in that way. Because then you're not putting in any of your own preconceived structure and how to do it. You can get a lot more efficiency by pre-training a network to learn some statistics that are in common with what you're trying to do. So if there's some structure to the learning task, like extracting different object names, pre-train the network and then retrain it further. And in practice, when many of you might be trying to do things with neural networks, this would absolutely be the approach to take. So from a functional perspective or practical perspective, yeah, take a pre-trained network and then train it more. But in a lot of, there's tons and tons of papers that are written where they do start from scratch and just have like a raw network that's trained on RL on the current task. I know that's quite a common approach. Yeah, so I wanted to say that, but go forward and add would.
I agree with you.
Okay. Yeah. Yes.
So in practice, we not only learn the state representation, but we also learn the action representation, right, in the form of temporal abstractions and macro actions. So these two learning systems are somewhat entwined, right?
Sorry, can you say that again? I was still thinking about the previous question.
So there's this work from Latent on temporal abstractions and essentially learning temporal independent actions and sub-policies, right? So in some sense, we not only learn the state representation and then we learn how to use it, but we also learn an action representation or in that sense. So how do you think about that? Or how does that fit into the whole grid cell, place cell, hippocampus story where more things, where it all seems.
I don't think we're going to provide a useful answer to that question. So I think we should move on. So I think we could just speculate, but there's no data on that question. So I think we should just, like the data on that question is automatic premotor cortex and that frontal hierarchy, where there's lots of data on that question, with no idea how that question pertains to the stuff we're talking about in the campus as far as I know. So I think we should probably just move on.
Cool. Yeah, so I think the question then comes, like you have this problem of deciding how much you share in common, and I think like part of the reason you would rarely like actually pre-train something from scratch if you wanted something to train efficiently would be that there's probably some other pre-trained network out there that already has a lot of the structure you want. Then there's the question of say, but that's like a somewhat like loosey-goosey way of putting it, which is I guess like maybe why there is some debate. It's like, how do you say there's some overlap between what this network already knows and the thing that it needs to know for this task? As we mentioned, the animations are weird here. But as we mentioned, there's this thinking about how you want to group states that you treat similarly to separate states that you can't. I meant to add citations there, but I forgot. And then so how do you formalize this notion? One idea, this is annoying, I'm sorry. One idea is this idea about an information bottleneck. you can express this formally as saying, I want my representation to have as much information as is relevant to the output. Everything about this input information, I want, all the things that I want to capture about this input information is that which is relevant to the to this downstream reinforcement learning process. If it needs to know something, I want to keep it in the code. And then any other information you should just discard. Knowing how to actually implement this is another question, but this is a nice way of formalizing what you might want. Yikes. I hope the rest of these don't format so poorly. Cool. And so I think this is a useful concept because it tells you that there's like kind of a formal notion of the information you want to capture, but it's a hard thing to do.
Quick question.
Yeah.
What do you mean by output there? It's not specific to a given task, right? It's a representation learning problem is across tasks.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's a really good point. So this also harkens back to a point that we talked about earlier, where when you're in one task, you have a limited amount that you can learn from it. You start the task and then you need to start figuring out what to do. But the number of times that you've seen maybe light sources, like a traffic light, or just objects in general, or the color red, is a much larger number of things. So you get a lot more relevant experience to this blue thing than you do to the red thing. And what this means is that you can use something kind of data inefficient to learn the representations because you're going to see so much data that's related to it. The process that it's really hard to be data inefficient with respect to is this reinforcement learning process, because once you get in it, you want to start being able to act right away. I want to already know what objects are and what colors are and what like steering wheels are and for the action abstractions before I get into the case where I'm starting to drive, which is why you take like a written test before you are allowed to start driving, is to make sure you have some of the relevant concepts and then you refine them through your experience.
And you can also build representations without any RL at all. You can build representations that would do something like predict the next visual image, right? Use something like, and if my representation includes the motion of a human and a face, you'll predict the next point in time much better than you will if it just is modeling pixels, right? Because all the human pixels are linked together. And so you can, I don't think that your brain, I don't think we're saying that your brain is building representations just for RL, right? It's building representations for predictive visual stimulus as well. Sure.
Yeah.
I have a question. So, yeah, like visual cortex seems to doing like this dimension reduction and efficient representation in cell, and probably auditory cortex or other sensory cortex will do the same. Then what does the hippocampus and trier system add for the prefrontal? Like when you say they are representing this efficient representation.
Yeah, so I guess to restate the question, just to make sure everyone can hear, the question is basically like, there's already all of these ideas about how visual cortex and other sensory cortices are producing these efficient representations of the observations you see. And what we've said about hippocampus and entorhinal cortex has largely been along the lines of like, it's an efficient representation of structure that you can use to start help planning. So what's like the difference between these types of efficient information? What does entorhinal cortex add on top of these other notions of efficient representation? And at least like my view on this and the hypotheses that we'll espouse later are that entorhinal cortex captures efficient things about or at least medial entorhinal cortex captures efficient information about transition structure and how things are linked in time. Whereas visual cortex will capture these factorized dimensions for it, or these separate dimensions that you might be able to reduce separately and express differently. So maybe visual cortex is trying to get a compressed version of objects, and then entorhinal cortex is getting a compressed version of how objects tend to transition among each other.
So the other thing to think about, so I agree with Tim that the notion of an event unrolling in time in a structured way is something that is really captured by hippocampal and medial prefrontal style schema representation. But I understand what's going on and I can make predictions about things through time. Another way I think to think about that more mathematically is that each of these visual cortex or auditory cortex might have efficient representations of the part of the problem that it's solving, but hippocampus is in this unique place that it has inputs from everywhere, and it has everything fanning into it, and it has this unique ability to put together all of those things together into a structured representation of the current time point of what it's like to be there right now. That's why people think about it as episodic memory. Like it's an episode of what it's like. Everything is like here right now, and then only once you've got that, can you do a really good job of predicting transitions, right? Because the same sound might predict a very different transition in different in different visual circumstances, right? Like a wolf growling at me will predict a very different response if it's on a television versus if it's right in my face. And so I think that that those structured contextual representations that need information from all parts of the brain, hippocampus is in a really good position to. This network we're talking about, so hippocampus, medial frontal cortex, medial parietal cortex, are in a really good position to build those types of representations.
Are you saying that the computation is the same as the inputs that are different?
Am I saying that? So I think that hippocampus has got very different computations to any cortical area, but I bet those other cortical areas do some things that are quite similar to the visual cortex in terms of computation, but are using very different types of things. Yeah.
Well, then for the sound manipulation task in like our notes, why is hippocampus needed? Like in that case, it's just one sensory modality.
I've literally no idea whether it is. I bet they could have done that task if they'd taken the hippocampus out. I'm sure you could do stretchy purrs without hippocampus as well. The fact that you see a correlation there doesn't mean it's needed. I bet it's not, in fact. I really bet that Aronoff could remove hippocampus.
Yeah, I mean, splitter cells too form in lots of tasks that are not hippocampally dependent. It seems like hippocampus is like, I mean, I guess the episodic story is it's just trying to record what's going on. Yeah. And even if it's not relevant right now, maybe you'll do some sort of interesting manipulation and it'll become relevant later, so it's trying to learn a map. But yeah, it does all sorts of like interesting stuff even when it's not needed, which I don't know, seems interesting.
It's 4:30.
Yeah, we're really behind.
So let's make some decisions.
Yeah,
I think kill my section if you want to, or you could kill parts of the state representation section. I think you should do eigenvectors.
Yeah, okay. I'm going to basically do the beginning of every section, I think. I'm going to try and spend 10 minutes on every section. Does that sound good?
I mean, it depends. It's 4:30, and so we could do 10 minutes on every section of yours and then kill mine, or we could do 10 more minutes of you.
I think we only have 3 sections left. Oh no, we have 4. Boy. Okay. Wow, we were so optimistic. We were so young back then.
Made too many slides.
Cool. So I think we don't know how much further we're going to have in this, so I just want to make sure we do cover this slide because it sets up some of the table of contents really for the sections that go on. There's these high-level theories about what makes a good representation, and there's also been a lot of just like kind of anecdotal different works pursuing this in the machine learning literature, as well as thinking about what sorts of things animals should use in order to form good representations for behavior. And I'm just going to sort of list them. One is predictive representations, and the motivation behind predictive representations is that if you cluster outcomes, or if you cluster states that predict similar outcomes and separate states that predict divergent outcomes, that's probably a good way to generalize, because 2 things that predict the same thing are probably going to have the same value associated with them. States that predict different things might have similar value, but they might have different, and that's flexibility you want to leave for your RL agent to figure out. You might want a low-dimensional representation so that you don't have too many dimensions to learn about at a time. The lower dimensional your task is, the less of it you need to see in order to learn effectively. Hierarchical representations give you this option of having very coarse, maybe low-dimensional, or maybe just kind of blurry representations of your task structure that you can plan at a high level at, but then give you the option of refining these when you want to execute lower-level motor behaviors. For instance, like one classic example is if you want to get to California, you're not going to think, I'm going to put 1 foot in front of the other, and 1 foot in front of the other, and another foot in front of the other, and just do that until you get to the airport and go through all of the sequence of steps. Instead, you're going to think, like, I'll go to the airport, I'll get a ticket, get on the plane. You think at this much higher, more coarse, sketchy level. I don't know why I said that. I've literally never done that in my life. but I don't know. I think I saw a movie where somebody did that recently. It must have been an old movie. But, okay, so you might want a representation that is encouraged to transfer well, and this means that you want to have the same representation that you can use for lots of different tasks. It captures this core of knowledge that's useful in all these different configurations of task structure and reward, but like this core module that never is changed. A disentangled representation has this property where you have separate dimensions of your observation that you can reason about independently. Maybe the color of something and the shape of the object are things that you can process entirely separately. If I have a cup and it's red, that's still a cup even if I change the color to blue. If I have a cup that's red and instead I take out a plate that's red, the fact that it is red stays the same. You have these things that can be thought about separately. And then you can reason about these dimensions independently and combine the answers, which is what's called compositionality. And then there's this idea of relational representations, which we already discussed quite a bit, which is a representation that captures something about task connectivity. Instead of representing something about maybe one state, you represent something about that state in relation to others. You say, maybe this cup looks similar to other cups, but I don't represent anything about the cup itself. Or maybe from this state, I can move to these other states, and which states can move to the same states is something that you want to capture. So these different objectives actually end up having quite overlapping implementations and really sometimes mean really similar things. They also have this, like, especially the way I presented them, they have this kind of structure where it's just like a table of contents, a kind of unordered list that doesn't necessarily imply obvious high-level structure. I think one of the key things to keep in mind about it is that they all capture some notion of generalization. Some person was thinking about how you should generalize, what a downstream reinforcement learning process should consider similar and different, and then thought of these objectives as a way to capture it. So I'll talk about predictive representations a little bit. This is kind of a quick sketch of a predictive representation. I found this awesome figure online. Basically, we introduced this idea of a one-hot vector to represent your current state. And that's a vector over all of the possible states you could occupy in your environment. One of them is 1, and it's 0 at all these other states. A predictive representation is also a vector representation of where you are. But instead of only saying something about where you currently are, it contains information about where you're going next to. So in this example, I'm going from this early state to all these later states. Maybe I'm getting closer to the mountains or something. And so I represent my current state as 1, but then some later states based on how that are coming up later. I also put some value in these elements of the vector to capture the fact that I'm going to see them. One way to do this is a kind of simple, one of the more simple ways to do this is something called a successor representation. I don't want to go into it in a ton of depth right now just because I want to make sure we get to some of the other stuff too. But I think so I'm going to skip how it relates to the value function, but I'm going to just tell you a little bit about what it kind of looks like. I did some work using this as a model of hippocampus, so my example is how this would compare to a classical notion of place. If you have a kind of canonical view of how space is represented in spatial cells in hippocampus, then you'd say all of these cells along the x-axis are encoding some location, and they're firing based on whether the animal's close or far away from them. This is just the formula for a Gaussian. I won't go into the terms. And then a successor representation is basically this idea that instead of representing current location, your hippocampal code is representing something about where you're going to go next. So in some environments, that just captures adjacency information because you can't go somewhere really far away in one step. You've got to stay somewhat nearby. But it'll skew in the direction that you're going to travel. So if the animal's going to go to the left a whole bunch of times or has gone to the left a whole bunch of times, you'll see a population that skews in that direction as well, and some of the upcoming states will fire a little bit extra. The utility of this representation, we can anchor it to this notion of transfer. So if we want to say, if we want to move reward around, then we can use this representation to capture some information and then only change the reward term. So let's say for both of these different hypothetical codes, we associate each state in the environment with some amount of reward. You can use the place representation to express how rewarding is the state that I'm currently thinking about. You can use the successor representation to say how much reward am I going to get in the future. It basically precompiles all these things that are going to happen next. So even though you're only representing how rewarding each state is at that one point in time, you have predictive information captured in your code, and that sort of automatically blurs the reward information over all of the states that predict it to. I'm going through this a little bit faster and differently than I usually do. But if there's any questions, just feel free to ask me later about it. I think the important takeaway is that it's capturing predictive information about what's going to come next in the code, and then this is immediately available to a reinforcement learning agent. So then all the agent has to do is learn a new reward vector if reward moves to a new location. Yes? It's different than, so it solves some of the problems of eligibility traces, but not all of them. An eligibility trace, basically what that does is say, instead of just learning about one state at a time, I'm going to update a whole bunch of states that I saw recently, because what are the odds that only the state I just saw is predictive of reward and none of the previous states are involved at all? Basically says, I'm going to take what I learned and send it to all of these different states. This is one property that the successor representation captures, because it's saying, based on how I move through this environment, I'm going to transfer reward information accordingly, and one of these things will be propagating it over long distances. But that doesn't necessarily capture this element of transferring reward location. So if your reward moves to a new location, but your dynamics, how you're moving through the environment, stays relatively the same, then you can just update the reward vector and get a new value function. It's not a matter of redoing a model-free learning process with an eligibility trace. Cool. So I think I'm going to skip to eigenvectors now. Yeah.
So I want to find the first part of the successor representation hypothesis, because I imagine if you can change the temporal discounting factors, you can get all kinds of patterns.
Yeah, this is interesting. I mean, so basically, like, we wrote this paper basically saying, like, from a normative perspective, this would make sense for a lot of reasons. But then we also, like, I guess just like had all this, on the one hand hedging and the other hand nuance, about how this might interact with other learning systems in the brain, when you would and wouldn't expect to get certain pre-compiled predictions. I think basically what we want to do is to just use take the normative perspective a step further and say, like, there's questions about how this would interact with model-based in an optimal way. Let's just formalize those and see if the successor representation firing patterns don't emerge in that context, we would say, like, it's probably not happening. Yeah, I mean, I think, like, it is a normative perspective. So saying, like, this doesn't actually match with what the data is would be one way to falsify it, and saying it's not useful actually is a harder thing to falsify. I think that's just generally true when you claim things are useful. Okay. So I do want to quickly mention this matrix just because we'll use it later. The successor, what's that? Oh,
it's not on screen.
Oh, it's not? Oh, right, thank you. I forgot I was in presenter mode. If we look at what I showed in that previous plot was what the successor representation would look like for one example location the animal's in. If you get that population vector for every possible location the animal can be in, then you can line all those vectors up into a matrix, and that's what this matrix is here. So one row of this matrix is what all of the cells look like at some point in time, given some location of the animal. If we look at a column, then that's what one cell is doing over all possible locations. So that corresponds more to a receptive field, whereas the other, the rows correspond more to a population vector, what all the cells are doing. And we can take this vector and reshape it so that each element of the vector is shown at the corresponding location in the task. And this is something that's useful for visualization, but doesn't necessarily capture something that we think the brain is doing about ordering it that way. So I already talked a bit about why predictive representations are good. In these slides, which we'll upload, there's some more information on, like, how we compare this to data and some other work that other people have done, including Ida Momenejad and Tim in his lab. But now I want to go back to the next item on our list, which was low dimensionality. So basically, if you have more things that you want to learn about, if you have more features to your space, your problem gets a lot harder, because now you need to learn about each of these dimensions instead of just one. But it turns out it actually gets even harder than that. There's this thing called the curse of dimensionality, which refers to the fact that the volume of your space grows a lot faster than your number of dimensions. And you can see that in these plots. If we think about half of a feature dimension, then that becomes a diminishing percentage of the volume of the space shown. Here it's half, in this one it's half, in that one it's a quarter, in that one it's an eighth. It just gets smaller and smaller. So you need way, way, way more data points in order to learn about this space. Low dimensionality is good. One of the core methods related to capturing low dimensionality is to use this mathematical tool called eigenvectors. And I think eigenvectors are very intimidating to a lot of people. I think a lot of people learn about them in school but don't really have an intuition for them. That's certainly the case when I learned them and continues to this day. I kind of think about it like the way you learn to enjoy drinking scotch or something, where you just have to learn not to fear them and then it becomes a lot more approachable. That's how my dad taught me to drink scotch. And I'm going to quickly go through a formalization and how that relates to the intuition. And if that's, I think it should take about 5 minutes. What you're going to, we're going to just illustrate this for a little toy matrix right now. It's going to be a 2x2 matrix, and we're going to name him B. We're going to have some vector and name her V. If we multiply these together, we get a new vector, and it's going to be a different length and pointing a different way. So that's V is shown in orange. BV is a new vector shown in brown. You'll notice it both rotated and it changed its length a little bit. There's some special vectors for this matrix which don't get rotated at all. They only get rescaled. So the vectors that we named U1 and U2 have this property. When we multiply B times U, we get a new vector that's way longer, but it points in fundamentally the same direction. So this is cool, and you're like, cool, fun math factoid. I can tell that to my friends when we're at the pub. But it's not obvious, at least to me, why this is useful necessarily. And I think that there's this counterintuitive thing that they have this really deep connection to compression. And the way you can think about that is that each of these, you can think about a matrix in terms of what it's doing when you multiply vectors by it. So it's moving them around in some way. And the eigenvector with the largest eigenvalue is the vector that's going to be moved the most by this matrix. It's capturing the most variance in how this matrix is moving things around. So you can end up capturing a lot of the information about what this matrix is doing by saying, in what direction is it trying to change things the most? And then you can think about how this matrix is behaving on other vectors by just saying, how much do those vectors align with this one that I know it moves a whole lot, or align with this vector that I know shrinks a whole lot, or doesn't move at all? Another way that's maybe not intuitive, but at least really familiar to people, is this example of PCA. You've got a bunch of data. It forms a point cloud. You can look at how these points vary with each other. And the eigenvectors of the covariance matrix will point you in the direction that's capturing the most variance in your data. So I think that is very intuitive about how it's a compressed representation of your data. If you plot how your data is distributed along principal component 1, you'll capture a lot of the interesting behavior. So we did this thing to think about grid cells, which was to do linear dimensionality reduction on the successor representation map. You get really similar behavior if you just look at a Gaussian view of the place cells as well. Basically, we took our matrix and we used this way of decomposing matrices where you can use the eigenvectors that you've pulled out and the eigenvalues and reconstruct the matrix, but losing a lot of the information. So along this diagonal of the eigenvalue matrix, we say how much is the eigenvalue of each of these eigenvectors. And you'll notice this matrix is, this eigenvector matrix doesn't have that many columns, and that's because we discarded a lot of them. So even though the original matrix is n by n, we can capture a lot of the information in it just by keeping the first k eigenvectors and recombining them in this mathematically allowed way. So if we use this to reconstruct our original matrix, we get something that looks pretty similar, but just loses a lot of the high-frequency information. It gets a lot blurrier, but it generally looks really similar. And hopefully that's visible at the level of resolution of this screen. If you take one of these vectors and reshape it the way we did before, to say, to get a receptive field out of it, to take each element in this vector, put it at its corresponding xy location, and then get a heat map, then we get these eigenvector receptive fields for the task, and that's how we're going to plot things. And we notice that this wave-like, and there's this wave-like structure to it that has some overlap with the idea of griddiness. So we explored the idea of using these as the simulation of grid cells. And so when I referred to earlier that there's a bunch of models where you can extract grid-like representations from transition statistics, this is one way that it's been done that I'm talking about just because it was a paper that we did. There's basically like various aspects of the data that we don't capture that well, and other models capture that to varying extents. One thing we do capture is how boundaries affect grid cell representations, that boundaries will shift them around. And this is because these eigenvectors don't depend on spatial structure, they depend on transition structure. And that's true in a lot of these models with this property. These eigenvectors also, should I talk about the nice properties or just skip this?
I think maybe, I mean,
It's really nearly time.
Yeah. I think if you carry on, then I won't do anything.
Okay.
Because I'm going to give a keynote tomorrow anyway.
Yeah.
So it's up to you. If you could just stop now, and then I'll give 20 minutes, or you could carry on, and I'll just do tomorrow.
Okay, I think I'm gonna skip the remaining sections. We'll post them online. I think a lot of people, every time I've ever presented this material, people are like, but what really are these eigenvectors? Why do they look that way? So I have some slides explaining that, but I think it is like what they're useful for.
Yeah.
But it's kind of a gamble whether I'll actually communicate this information effectively anyway.
I'll just give a
cool
15 minutes
okay.
of a sort of preview of the kinds of things I'm going to say tomorrow. So where are we? Yeah. So as Kim was saying earlier, there are one of the things you want to do in your can you hear me? One of the things you want to do in your state representation is to make nice latent states, because sometimes because when your visual input is not going to tell you everything you need to know about the transition structure, which is what you really need to know to understand the task. And so I'm just going to give you a few slides for how mathematically you can think about building latent states or extracting transition structures from a task. And to do that, I was going to introduce some Bayesian ways of thinking about getting latent variables out of pixels. And so this is the fundamental problem of life, I think, which is there's something useful in the world, like there's a wolf over there, and there's some sensory data, and we want to know how to get from here to there. And if you're not going to, if you haven't got any labels, and you're not going to learn that by a whole lifetime of RL, as a deep net would do, then you need another way of doing it. So we haven't got any labels. And what Bayes says is, okay, well, I can try to solve this problem a different way by imagining I was trying to solve the opposite problem, which is I build a generative model from my latent variables to my sensory data. And right now, those latent variables are something like there's a wolf in the world, but we want to move to a situation where those latent variables are like the transition structures that Kim's been telling you all about right now. That's where we want to end up, right? So I'll just briefly tell you how you do this in the visual world. So what Bayes says is if I know this generative model, then I'm okay because I can just use this Bayes equation, which is famous, everyone knows, and I can get back to the other one. So that's roughly what they want to do. So that looks like something like this. Here's a generative model of this shadow here. And it says, oh, look, this has been constructed by some combination of things. It's sun and either not very likely to be a fish, could be a dog, probably a wolf, not very likely to be a cat. And then using Bayes, I want to go this other way and invert it to get back to the probability of given the picture, to get back to the probability of the latent cause given the sensory observations. And so there were a couple of problems with that. The first problem is we don't actually know what the generative model looks like. We've just got a bunch of neurons in our brains with synapses between them. That's got to become a generative model of the world. And the second problem is that we can't actually invert it because this this equation here involves a term which would take more than the amount of time that the universe has existed to compute, even if you've got a lot of neurons. And so there are loads of solutions to this problem, and in fact there's a whole keynote on this that Matt is going to give. It's a really fun problem in the sensory domain, but I'm just going to, I've introduced it because there are some fun ways of solving it that people in deep learning have worked on. So for example, Peter Dayan and Jeff Hinton invented this thing called the Helmholtz machine, where you can try to train the generative model and the inference model one after the other against each other. So you kind of pretend you know the generative model and then train the inference model, and pretend you know the inference model and train the generative model. And the great thing about that is it turns it into two supervised learning problems that kind of compete against each other. And eventually that converges to a good solution. That's called the Helmholtz machine. Yeah, so that's called the Helmholtz machine. And there's another one that I thought I was going to get a VAE next. Yeah, okay. So that turns this problem of the generative model into something that will infer that there's a wolf there, or it's not actually, or maybe a cat there. That's my normal example of Bayesian inference going wrong. Okay, so there's a Helmholtz machine which solves this by playing these things off against each other. And recently, a whole bunch of people have done some awesome work making these work in really, really big networks called variational autoencoders, which have generated a whole bunch of those really cool deep fake images that you guys have seen on the web. And that's those are all based on these ideas that came from how to invert Bayesian models to get at latent causes. And yeah, so the question that's part of the question that I'm going to be addressing tomorrow is, can we use these kinds of techniques instead of to address instead of to infer latent causes, can we get them to learn latent transition structures? And so I'll flick through these. And so you're going to want to build models that can go from sensory data up to transition structures. And in fact, I'm going to tell you about something even slightly more complicated than that, because I'm going to add a hippocampal-like memory in the middle of it, which is going to be really cool, because what that's going to do is it lets you generalize transition structures across lots of different domains, because you can now take the transition structure and separate it away from the sensory domain and tie new sensory objects to the same transition structure. And that's basically going to be our model of the hippocampus. And I'm just going to preview it very quickly and tell you that when you play those kinds of games, you end up with grid-like cells in the transition structure and place-like cells in the hippocampal memories, and various other things, which should entertain you tomorrow morning. And the last section that I want to tell you about is this idea of how you can use. So here what we have is something that's separated the transition structure from the sensory elements, so you can generalize to new worlds, and that's kind of what grid cells are doing. But that's not really much use to you unless you're always wandering around an exactly similar 2D square. What you actually want to do is make some new worlds out of lots of combinations of other worlds. So you want your state spaces to be flexibly composable. And that's the other thing that I'm going to try and tell you about tomorrow. And I think I'm probably not going to try and tell you about it now, because I can see a lot of people sleeping. But I'm going to just preview the fact that if we can learn to factorize these representations, we can predict fun things like object vector cells and boundary cells, which allow you to compose new worlds. So, for example, where you can place objects in and you can get transition structures where the animals will automatically run to the objects, or you can get worlds where it can build new worlds out of the kind that it's never, out of bits of other worlds, of the kind that it's never seen before. And so I think that that's an exciting and interesting preview to what I'm going to say tomorrow. And I think that we should just all celebrate Kim and say thank you very much indeed for coming, because we're all tired.
This is unfortunate, but I have to end on a like a fairly logistical note. So before that, I want to thank a bunch of people who are not here for slides that they contributed to this. These people are Jakob, Kevin, Jesse, Ida, and Thomas. And also say if you want to like mess around with some code that deals with some of these ideas, there was this summer school that Dartmouth put on cognitive maps. And for this, I had to make a tutorial where we have a Jupyter notebook that goes through some of the actual code and implementation of some of the ideas. It's on their website. We'll upload the slides. You can find it there. There's also a lot of other great code just related to cognitive maps that the other teachers uploaded. This was not relevant. That's back when I thought we were going to have time for questions. And then there's also a bunch of stuff on future reading. I think there was a couple RL classics that I threw up, but then I just got intimidated by the idea of listing them all. There's also some papers on model-based RL, representation learning, and then using learned representations to plan. So if you're interested in learning more about these ideas, that's some resources you have. Thank you, everybody, very much.